2. Being political for a Marxist, in other words, required making daily judgments only what a newspaper and not a magazine, journal, or similar venue permitted. Weber, at the same time, was emphatic that his essays were not academic, making, therefore, for a fairer comparison with Lenin's writings. Beyond the preliminaries in his introductory footnote, it becomes immediately clear that Weber's focus in his BDR was narrow. Anyone new to what was underway in Russia would never have learned from his account about the details of Bloody Sunday or anything of substance about the chief dynamic in the upheavals, the massive strikes. For Weber, rather, his concern was for the prospects of the liberal movement as an alternative to not only the monarchy but the Bolsheviks as well. 42 He began with a brief history of the Zemstvo movement, one of the two milieus that birthed the liberals of 1905, specifically, the Constitutional Democrats or Cadet Party. The Zemstvo, again, were the organs of local government that the monarchy instituted in 1864, a concession to the democratic yearnings from below but without any real power. Along with their officials were the civil servant professionals they employed such as teachers, doctors, statisticians, the so-called third element. The other milieu from which the liberals of 1905 originated was the intelligentsia. They grouped, in Weber's account, around the bi-monthly publication of Peter Struve, Osvobozdany, beginning in 1902. Tsarist censorship required publication abroad and for its supporters, the Union of Liberation, to resort to necessarily conspiratorial organization. Struve, Weber added, is well known to readers of this journal, with his profound and expert knowledge of capitalism, originally influenced by Marx. His most important contribution was to declare in favor of in the broadest sense of the word bourgeois democracy, especially for driving populist romanticism out of the heads of the social reformers. Weber no doubt was referring to the Marxist critique of the populist Narodnaya Volya Party, or, the Narodniks. And in that connection he made his first reference to Lenin, who too had briefly collaborated with Struve in this campaign. 43 Weber noted, but without comment, that when the Union was formed in 1903 only official social democracy had excluded itself, that is, before the split into the Bolshevik and Menshevik wings. But Weber's main purpose in his essay was to render a judgment on the democratic content of the constitutional proposals of the cadets. Before examining his assessments, a look at what Lenin also wrote about the liberal movement prior to 1905 is in order, which can only be at best a distillation since it was at least 20-fold greater than all that Weber wrote. Lenin, as Weber's point about Russian social democracy suggests, had long followed and commented on the Zemstvo movement to also determine its potential for contributing to Russia's bourgeois democratic revolution, a fact, again, ignored by friend and foe alike. 44 His 50-page aforementioned 1901 pamphlet, Persecutors of the Zemstvo and the Hannibals of Liberalism, registered how informed he was about its history, the first of his in-depth writings about the institution and its accompanying political current that Weber only discovered in 1905. On the eve of Bloody Sunday, Lenin explained in a 20-page pamphlet that there were two stages in his writings on the Zemstvo current: judgments prior to and after the formation of the already mentioned Union of Liberation in 1903. For the first stage, he viewed them as possible allies to advance the much-needed bourgeois democratic revolution in Russia, possible being the operative word. But his pamphlet disputed Struve's claim that they might be the embryo of a constitution. Yet, Lenin encouraged liberals to fight for political liberties because their acquisition was in the interest of the proletariat, who must have freedom in order to develop the struggle for socialism to the utmost. 45. Ever in search of any political openings, Lenin followed the Zemstvo movement closely. About a secret congress some of them held in 1901, he implored that they show some courage, as one of the delegates had demanded. We are in complete agreement with the outcry of this liberal who is prepared to challenge the bureaucratic autocracy to open struggle. If the best Zemstvo men do not today take energetic measures, if they do not get rid of their usual attitude, their trivial questions of secondary importance tinkering, as one venerable Zemstvo man put it, the Zemstvos will lose their adherents and turn into the usual government offices. Such an inglorious death is inevitable, for one cannot with impunity for whole decades do nothing but show cowardice, offer thanks, and humbly petition. One must threaten, demand, stop wasting time on trifles, and settle down to the real work. 46. Lenin clearly was prepared to fight side by side with the Zemstvo liberals if they were prepared to fight. They were not, as events would show, hence, as he accurately foresaw, their inglorious death. In his 1902 classic What is to be Done, for example, he wrote that the workers cannot look on indifferently while the government is waging a struggle against the Zemstvo, and the Zemstvos are called upon to stop making mild speeches and to speak firmly and resolutely when revolutionary social democracy confronts the government in all its strengths. There was one component of the Zemstvo that both Lenin and Weber were positive about, the previously mentioned third element. These were, again, the professionals hired by them such as doctors, teachers, agronomists, and statisticians. 47 For Weber, the evident idealism and willingness to make sacrifices shown by these men, the only category of civil servants who really live among and with the people, is one of the most ethically pleasing and estimable things that today's Russia has to offer. 48 4 years earlier in 1901 Lenin came to their defense against Tsarist detractors who feared that the hired professionals had interests independent of the land-owning elites. In so doing, Lenin came also to the defense of parliamentarism against its Tsarist detractors, that is, those who claimed that a political system based on the interests of the landed elite, an autocracy, was somehow politically and morally superior to parliamentary governance. 49 Not the first or last time would he counterpoise the advantages of parliamentarism against the backwardness of Tsarism. Once Stroev's Union of Liberation was formed in 1903, Lenin took a more critical stance, but not on principle. Rather, it was the actual conduct of the liberals that earned his ire. Their tendency to prevaricate and be irresolute when it came to actually fighting for bourgeois democracy was the reason. Never was Lenin as clear about needed sobriety about Russian liberalism than on the eve of the 1905 revolution. 2 months before the social earthquake, he urged Russian social democrats to recognize that the Zemstvo movement, its redeeming features notwithstanding, was being bypassed by history and admonishment to the Menshevik wing of Russian social democracy. At this of all times, the political activity of the proletariat must be focused on organizing powerful pressure on the government, not on the liberal opposition. Particularly now, agreements between the workers and the Zemstvoists about peaceful demonstrations, agreements which would inevitably boil down to the staging of musical comedy effects, are utterly out of place. What is needed is to rally the advanced, revolutionary elements of the proletariat in preparation for a decisive struggle for freedom. Particularly now, it is vital to build up in the revolutionary proletariat the firm conviction that the present emancipation movement in society will necessarily and inevitably prove a bubble like all the others before it, unless the force of the worker masses, capable of and ready for an uprising, intervenes. The way for the workers to give serious support to the Zemstvo petitions is not by concluding agreements about the conditions on which the Zemstvoists would have a right to speak in the name of the people, but by striking a blow at the people's enemies. And the workers will rise still more fearlessly, in still greater numbers, to finish off the bear, to win by force for themselves what is promised as charity to the liberal bourgeois gentry: freedom of assembly, freedom of the workers' press, full political freedom for a broad and open struggle for the complete victory of socialism. 50. In clear and unequivocal language, quintessential Lenin, he explained how workers in that moment should respond to the Zemstvo campaign and to liberal initiatives in general. Unlike those of the liberals, its demands had to be for full political democracy needed for the socialist revolution. Of crucial significance for real-time politics, Lenin penned these lines about a month and a half before Bloody Sunday. It is hard to find anything in the Lenin arsenal before 1905 that is so exemplary of the spirit of his 1902 polemic: what is to be done, how to prepare for a revolution. When Weber, therefore, discovered the Zemstvo movement sometime in mid-1905 with the hope that it could be the agent of Russia's bourgeois democratic movement, Lenin had concluded at least a half-year earlier that it was Russia's still developing working class that would actually be the protagonist for the country's democratic revolution. Nothing in Weber's political makeup would have made him open to that alternative. If he dismissed Germany's working class in playing such a role, as he argued in his inaugural address, why would he have thought any better of Russian workers? Lenin, on the other hand, was open, at least for 5 years, to the possibility that Russian liberals could get their act together, to actually lead a democratic revolution just as Marx and Engels had once thought about their German counterparts. They never did. And therein lies the essential answer to the age-old question that opens this chapter: why wasn't there a liberal alternative to the Bolsheviks in the Russian Revolution? In the years and months leading up to 1905, Russian liberals had an opportunity to duplicate what their counterparts in the West had done. But once the bloodletting of January 9 had taken place, the Russian working class was forced onto the center stage of history to become the leading protagonist, ensuring, therefore, that Russia's democratic revolution would not be limited to meeting the class interests of its bourgeoisie. Liberals, again, had missed their moment in the sun. They had prevaricated far too long. And even then, 2 days after learning about Bloody Sunday, Lenin wrote, "Liberalism, of whatever kind, merits support by the Social Democrats only to the extent that it actually opposes the autocracy." 51 actions, as always, and not words were decisive for Lenin. There is no reason to believe that had Weber paid attention to Russia before that fateful Sunday he would have looked beyond its liberal layers for realizing its bourgeois democratic revolution. His political blinders and prejudices about the working class prevented him from seeing what Lenin could. It stamped, to be seen, ineluctably what so distinguished his reading of the Russian events from Lenin's. Comparing Lenin and Weber in real time 1905. Most evident about Weber's backstory to 1905 is the absence of any sustained discussion about its essential dynamo from the very beginning in January: the unruly crowds in the streets. It gets at best cursory treatment. Bloody Sunday merits only one mention: the slaughter of 9/22 January. Lenin, on the other hand, argued that it was precisely the mass mobilizations throughout the year that made it possible for there to be even any consideration of a liberal option like a national zemstvo, a zemsky sober, a constitutional monarchy, or better, a republic. Hence, his retort in October to those who thought like Weber: "We must fight in a revolutionary way for a parliament, but not in a parliamentary way for a revolution." And by revolution, he meant, again, a bourgeois democratic revolution. The near exclusive attention to the writing of the Constitution, the focus of Weber's BDR, was for Lenin putting the proverbial cart before the horse. There is one telling point Weber made about the constitutional drafters that Lenin would probably have agreed with: the economic clash of interests and the class character of the proletariat is a stab in the back for the specifically bourgeois reformers. That is the fate of their work here as everywhere. 52 This reveals that Weber was not only conversant with but in apparent agreement with some of the basic premises of the historical materialist fount that informed Lenin. Liberal reformers and workers at this stage in history had fundamentally different and conflictual class interests. Hence, as Lenin had increasingly recognized, that is why liberals would not lead Russia's democratic breakthrough, their visceral fear that it would aid and abet working class hegemony, a stab in the back. Weber, a Bürgerliche scholar, could easily recognize and identify with that fear and, hence, I argue his reading of 1905. Nowhere in his essay were Weber's politics on better display than in his treatment of the socialist parties. His description of Russian social democracy and the Bolshevik/Menshevik split that emerged after the 1903 Party Congress is accurate for the most part. But his characterization of Lenin and the Bolsheviks as putschists is problematic. Maybe the origins of this time-worn charge about Lenin. Though Weber didn't define putschism, it generally meant then and now a political orientation that advocates for the overthrowing of a government by a small group of fighters, exactly why Lenin took umbrage. In 1916, a half-year before he criticized Weber's charge, Lenin offered a definition. The term putsch, in its scientific sense, may be employed only when the attempt at insurrection has revealed nothing but a circle of conspirators or stupid maniacs, and has aroused no sympathy among the masses. 53 As already documented, Nothing in his calls for an insurrection in 1905 ever suggested such a strategy. When he first did in August that year, after the mass uprising in Odessa, it was always about the overthrow of the autocracy rather than just a government. And it could be realized only by a victorious rising of the people, only by the complete domination of the armed proletariat and the peasantry, a mass mobilization in other words. It is just why Lenin criticized, long before 1905, terrorists. They, always a courageous but tiny minority, relegated the masses to being spectators rather than protagonists. That the Odessa uprising coincided with the famed sailors' mutiny on the battleship Potemkin for the first time, Lenin wrote, an important unit of the armed forces of Tsarism, a battleship, has openly gone over to the side of the revolution, gave him good reason to think a mass-based insurrection was a possibility. Social democracy never stooped to playing at military conspiracies. It never gave prominence to military questions until the actual conditions of civil war had arisen. 54 Odessa and its significance is virtually absent in Weber's account. Weber may have been right that there were indeed Bolsheviks who believed that an insurrection to overthrow the autocracy could be done by a small group of armed men. Not Lenin. In a stinging rebuke to such thinking in the most intense moment in 1905, September, October, during the broadest strike wave in the country, when insurrection was a real possibility, he declared that unless the Bolshevik Combat Committee in St. Petersburg makes contact with a minimum of 200 or 300 groups, then it is a dead combat committee. It will have to be buried. Its task was to train hundreds of experienced fighters, who tomorrow will be leading hundreds of thousands. It was a plea to the Bolsheviks to broaden their ties to the mass movement. Do not refuse to contact any group and to take initiatives. Do not wait for our help. 55 Writing from afar, Weber might be excused for not knowing about the real Lenin given the audience his letter was directed to. Nevertheless, those are the facts, and it behooves like-minded Lenin detractors to produce the putschist smoking gun. It simply does not exist, at least when Weber's otherwise observant eyes paid attention to the Russian events. Weber's characterization of the sect-like character of social democracy with its close ties to strictly precise dogmas is instructive. Like the thoroughgoing Jesuit, the devout Marxist is imbued by his dogma with the blithely superiority and the self-assurance of the somnambulist. Disdaining to strive for lasting political success, and confident of being above reproach, he accepts with equanimity and a mocking laugh the collapse of all hopes, his own included, of overcoming the mortal foe he shares with other groups, is always exclusively concerned with the preservation of the pure faith and if possible the increase of his own sect by a few souls, and seeks the unmasking of those who are also Catholics here of traitors to the people there, in neighboring groups. 56. Clearly on display were Weber's anti-Catholic biases related to his lifelong anti-Polish tendencies in opining about the Bolsheviks. Here is an excerpt from the article Social Democracy's Attitude Toward the Peasant Movement. Lenin wrote to fellow Bolsheviks at about the same time when Weber was disparaging them. The urban and industrial proletariat will inevitably be the nucleus of our Social Democratic Labor Party, but we must attract to it, enlighten, and organize all who labor and are exploited as stated in our program, all without exception, handicraftsmen, paupers, beggars, servants, tramps, prostitutes, of course, subject to the necessary and obligatory condition that they join the social democratic movement and not that the social democratic movement join them, that they adopt the standpoint of the proletariat, and not that the proletariat adopt theirs. 57. If Lenin was creating a sect, as Weber charged, it was a remarkably inclusive one. When the monarchy issued its manifesto on October 17, its first real flirtation with representative democracy, Lenin saw it as vindication for Bolshevik support to the mass insurrectionary movement that the uprising in Odessa in July spearheaded. 58 Long familiar with Russia's liberal bourgeoisie and its lack of resolve for the democratic struggle, Lenin, as always, sought to make it a teachable moment. No, gentlemen of the bourgeoisie, the workers will never forget the enforced nature of the Tsar's capitulation. The workers will never forget that it was only by force, by the force of their organization, their unanimity, and their mass heroism, that they wrested from Tsarism a recognition of liberty in a paper manifesto, and only in this way will they win real liberty for themselves. 59. It was also vindication, he declared, for those like the Bolsheviks who called for an active boycott of the aforementioned Buligin Duma proposal in August, the regime's moribund attempt to pretend to be granting representative democracy. The most that Weber had to initially say in BDR about why the manifesto was granted is that it appeared to be due to the effect of the strike without any elaboration and done so quickly, that it made the structural weakness of the old regime seem considerably greater than it was. 60. No, wrote Lenin, Tsarism is still far from having surrendered. The autocracy has by no means fallen as yet. And most prophetically, many great battles will still have to be fought by the revolutionary proletariat, and the first victory will help it to rally its forces and enlist new allies in the struggle. 61. Barely able to utter strike to explain the Tsar's concessions, Weber could have been one of those bourgeois gentlemen Lenin was needling. As previously noted, the Soviets or councils were an unexpected development for Lenin. Again, they began simply as organs for factory workers to coordinate the general strike in the summer/fall. Weber described the most important of the approximately 50 throughout mainly Western Russia, the Council of Workers' Deputies in St. Petersburg. It consists of deputies of each factory with at least 400 workers, and is thus a representation of the specifically workers' elite of big industry on a local basis, not on the basis of specific industries. Though most prominent among the workers' organizations, of a socialist character, they were not created by the party. 62. Further comments suggest that he followed as close as he could from afar the deliberations of the St. Petersburg Soviet, including the regime's arrest of its Menshevik president on November 26, portending its eventual fate. But what Weber accurately described was only the beginning of wisdom for Lenin. In his first substantive comments on the Soviets he began almost apologetically in begging to differ with the Bolsheviks on the scene. He was writing as an onlooker from the accursed afar. Nevertheless, he disagreed with those who had a narrower or, perhaps, more sectarian attitude toward the Soviets, specifically, the main one in St. Petersburg. I think it would be inadvisable for the Soviet to adhere wholly to any one party. The Soviet of Workers' Deputies came into being through the general strike, in connection with the strike, and for its aims. Who led the strike and brought it to a victorious close? The whole proletariat, which includes non-social democrats, fortunately a minority. What were the aims of the strike? They were both economic and political. The economic aims concerned the whole proletariat, all workers, and partly even all working people, not the wage workers alone. The political aims concerned all the people, or rather all the peoples, of Russia. Those aims were to free all the peoples of Russia from the yoke of the autocracy, survivals of serfdom, a rightless status, and police tyranny. It seems to me that the Soviet, as an organization representing all occupations, should strive to include deputies from all industrial, professional and office workers, domestic servants, farm laborers, etc., from all who want and are able to fight in common for a better life for the whole working people. 63. Again, if Lenin was seeking to create a sect as Weber charged, he was remarkably ecumenical in his approach. His inclusivity, to the contrary, was consistent with his long-held views. Obviously, as his letter suggests, there were Bolsheviks who deserved Weber's criticism. But not Lenin. 64. There was another side to the St. Petersburg Soviet of even greater import for Lenin that had to do with its inclusive or potentially inclusive character for which he advocated. The fact that there were fighters active in it from other political parties, particularly, the socialist revolutionaries, was an advantage, not a disadvantage. As long as they were revolutionary bourgeois democrats willing to fight was all that mattered. That they believe in God, or defend mysticism, was of no import. Decisive is that they possess vitality. 65. The Soviet, in fact, he declared, must proclaim itself the provisional revolutionary government, or form such a government, and must by all means enlist to this end the participation of new deputies not only from the workers, but, first of all, from the sailors and soldiers, who are everywhere seeking freedom; secondly, from the revolutionary peasantry; and thirdly, from the revolutionary bourgeois intelligentsia. 66. Thus, for the first time Lenin sketched out Soviet representative democracy as an alternative to parliamentary representative democracy. In hindsight, Lenin's 1905 letter from that accursed afar anticipated, almost uncannily, his more famous letters from afar in March 1917, that outlined his course for that momentous year. Weber may be forgiven for not knowing Lenin's actual views since his letter wasn't published until 1940.67. Nevertheless, again, those are the facts about the real Lenin, far from the sectarian portrait he painted. For Lenin's critics since then, their calumnies about Lenin the ogre, certainly for this period, are inexcusable. There is clearly one sentence in Weber's narrative that Lenin would have readily embraced. It introduces the lengthiest section in BDR, the agrarian question. The crucial question which will determine the future not only of the constitutional democratic movement but, more importantly, of its fundamental program, and beyond that the chances of a liberal development in the Western European sense, concerns the peasants. 68. Lenin, about the same time, in his previously cited article about the significance of the Manifesto of October 17 and in What is to be done mode, wrote: "The revolutionary proletariat has brought about the first great victory of the urban revolution. It must now broaden and deepen the foundations of the revolution by extending it to the countryside. To raise the peasantry to the level of conscious defense of the cause of liberty, to demand that serious measures be taken in the interests of the peasantry, and to prepare in the countryside a movement which, in conjunction with the advanced urban proletariat, will deal the final blow at the autocracy and win complete and genuine liberty such is Russian social democracy's next task." 69. Both he and Weber were, therefore, at least on the same page about the weighty role of the peasantry in Russia's future. After a detailed account of how the mainstream parties, especially the Cadets, addressed the all-important issue of agrarian reform, Weber concluded, "The party that aims to carry through the reform by legal means has an unenviable task." 70. The reality of the autocracy, in other words, made real agrarian reform unlikely. And that's exactly why Lenin argued that all efforts to carry out a real agrarian reform depended on the overthrow of the autocracy. Thus, while Weber was examining what parties like the Cadets had written about the peasantry, Lenin was trying to figure out how to link the urban struggle with the yet fully emergent rural struggle, the advance guard with the rear guard as he put it. 2 weeks after the Tsar's October Manifesto, Lenin wrote, "Events have begun to provide telling confirmation of a truth we long ago proclaimed to our readers, and shall repeat over and over again, namely, that until Tsarism's actual power is overthrown, all its concessions, and even a constituent assembly, are a phantom, a mirage, a piece of deception." 71. While in agreement with Lenin about the import of the peasant question, Weber thought it inconceivable, unlike Lenin, that Russia's peasants could be won to the cause of liberty, let alone in an alliance with the advanced urban proletariat headed by the Lenin Group. The work to be done on the formidable and fundamental agrarian problem cannot possibly be undertaken with the intellectual tools of Marxism. 72. To be successful, it seems vital that liberalism continues to see its vocation as fighting against both bureaucratic and Jacobin centralism. Opposing all that Lenin represented, as he understood, was Weber's recommendation to Russian liberals. Never did he examine Lenin's proposals for agrarian reform, an issue the Bolshevik leader had given extensive attention to from the very beginning of his political career. No formulation epitomized more the weight he gave to it than his slogan, "The revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry," elaborated on in his 100-page book in 1905, Two Tactics of Social Democracy in the Democratic Revolution. In the context of an insurgency still unfolding, the task was figuring out how to realize that slogan. Only if the proletarian/peasant majority imposed its will, complete domination, a dictatorship in other words, could the agrarian problem Weber correctly diagnosed be solved. Weber's contempt for the Bolsheviks explains his portrait of the Moscow uprising which was in progress when he ended his essay. In fact, He provided hardly any details other than to say in one of his many notes that the Leninist group, and a section of the socialist revolutionaries, have been planning the foolish revolt for a long time. 73 Weber did elaborate on what he thought of the Lenin group. Correct social democracy drills the masses in the intellectual parade ground step and refers them to a paradise in this world, making of it a kind of inoculation against change for those with an interest in preserving the status quo. It accustoms its charges to the unquestioning acceptance of dogmas, submissiveness towards party authorities, to ostentatious mass strikes which achieve nothing, and to the passive consumption of the tiresome invective of their journalists, which provides its authors with a comfortable living. It accustoms them, in other words, to a hysterical indulgence in emotion, which takes the place of economic and political thought and action. On this barren ground, once the eschatological age of the movement has passed and generation after generation has clenched its fists in its pockets in vain or bared its teeth heavenwards, only intellectual torpor can grow. 74. Weber was clearly no friend of the Bolsheviks. His characterization of what came to be called Leninism may be the first of its kind. It anticipated many of the usual subsequent charges about Leninism cum Stalinism. But it wasn't the reality Lenin knew about the Bolsheviks. Even if he had wanted to, and there is nothing to suggest that he did, Lenin was in no position to impose his will. The fact that he couldn't get his comrades to publish his article calling for a non-sectarian stance toward the Soviets speaks volumes about the Lenin Group in 1905. Once Lenin was back in Russia in early November, his paper trail, unfortunately for posterity, was much thinner. Only in March next year would he have regular access to a newspaper. Thus, it is not clear to what extent he knew beforehand, as Weber suggests, about the Moscow uprising in early December, the last gasp of the 1905 revolution. Local Bolsheviks were certainly involved. It erupted while he and other Bolshevik leaders were meeting in Tammerfors, Finland, which they ended early in order to get to the scene. What is known is that Lenin, like Trotsky, thought that Russia's urban proletariat, particularly in St. Petersburg, was by November exhausted after months of continuous mobilizing. In a letter to St. Petersburg comrade Maria Essen on October 26 he recommended the time for the uprising along with details about how to prepare it. I repeat, I would willingly postpone until the spring 75. It would give the rear guard, the peasantry, time to catch up with the advance guard, the urban proletariat. A month before the uprising he wrote, the revolutionary people have still to solve many important military problems before they will be able to carry the revolution to real and final victory. 76. Lastly, his actions at the Tammerfors meeting suggests that he thought the revolutionary wave had already ebbed before the Moscow uprising and, therefore, would have been an unlikely advocate for it. 77. In January 1917, as noted at the outset of this chapter, Lenin excoriated Herr Professor Max Weber for characterizing the Moscow uprising as a putsch and a senseless uprising that had been long prepared by the Lenin Group and a section of socialist revolutionaries. 78. Lenin countered with a list of figures to show that the revolt was in fact a mass action accompanied by a general strike that lasted for more than a week. What he didn't say, understandably, is that it failed owing to poor planning and was probably premature, contravening, in other words, Lenin's advice. 79. Whether he knew or was involved in the plans, he also didn't say. But there is no evidence that he did and why it likely failed. In the last weeks of 1905, if not before, Weber became pessimistic about the chances for a liberal outcome in Russia. The defeat of the Moscow rebels heralded, he accurately saw, a new era's pseudo-constitutionalism. He could envision by then only one ending for the Romanovs. Only in the tragic event of a European war would the autocracy finally be destroyed. 80. Here was Weber at his prophetic best, for indeed that is exactly how the 300-year-old dynasty came to its ignominious end, in February 1917. The problem is that Weber could not envision any party other than the liberals being the beneficiaries of such a conflagration. Certainly not Lenin's Bolsheviks. For the time being, Weber concluded, Russia's liberals may have to be content for this brilliant movement of Zemstvo liberalism, of which Russia has as much reason to be proud as we Germans have to be proud of the Frankfurt Parliament, to be consigned to history, at least in its present form. 81. Lenin, as already noted, had a quite different opinion about the Frankfurt Parliament of 1848. In fact, he drew on its example by way of Marx and Engels to rebuke Russian liberals and those like the Mensheviks who had any hopes in them. The context, to repeat, was the monarchy's August 6 Bulletin Duma proposal, the moribund faux parliament, to which he counterposed an active boycott, that is, insurrection. Going along with the Tsar's bait-and-switch trick, he charged, meant playing at parliamentarism when no parliament whatever exists. It has been well said, we have no parliament as yet, but we have parliamentary cretinism galore. Coined by Engels and often employed by Lenin, parliamentary cretinism referred to the mistaken belief of the Frankfurt parliamentarians, disproportionately academics, that their deliberations, including the writing of the ideal liberal constitution, were the beginning and end of politics. Prussian King Frederick IV sent them packing without a fight a year later in 1849. He must expose, Lenin demanded, the venal soul of a Frankfurt Parliament windbag in every adherent who shuns the slogan of insurrection. 82. Humanity paid dearly for the failure. 2 world wars were required to plant liberal democracy in German soil for the first time. Lenin's lines are worth repeating because nothing in their texts better reveals the core differences between him and Weber than their attitudes about the Frankfurt Parliament. It was when the Moscow revolt was being suppressed that Weber revisited his explanation for the Tsar's October 17 manifesto. Without the warning from foreign financiers, not in so many words but by implication, the manifesto of October 17 would perhaps never have been issued, or at least it would soon have been revoked. Fear of the rage of the masses and of the mutiny of the troops, and the weakening of the authoritarian regime by defeat in the East, would have been ineffective had not the autocracy been at the mercy of the cool, hard hand of the banks and stock exchanges. 83. A few months later he added, it is quite correct to say that the Jews forced through, brought about by stealth or at least helped to construct the Russian constitution, in high finance in Berlin and Paris, who are entrusted with the control of the prices of Russian government stocks. 84. Thus, for the first time the reader of BDR sees what is so sorely missing in Weber's account of 1905, but only for the purpose of rendering them at best a secondary factor. Weber was politically incapable of thinking that the crowds in the streets are decisive in history. Lenin too acknowledged the role finance capital, both foreign and domestic, played in the drama of 1905. Hence, his explanation for the regime's ill-fated August Bulletin Duma proposal: it was impossible to govern the country, to obtain money, or to continue existing without coming to terms with the right wing of the bourgeoisie. The autocratic government is the government of a capitalist country, linked with Europe, with international markets and international capital by thousands of inseverable ties. 85. As for Nicholas's October manifesto, Lenin noted, the European bourgeoisie is sighing with relief. The stock exchange is hastening to express fuller confidence in Russia's finances. Russian securities, which have been falling for the last few days, are now going up. The foreign bankers who fled from revolutionary St. Petersburg are promising to return within a fortnight. In the constitution the European bourgeoisie sees a pledge of peaceful minor concessions, which will wholly satisfy the propertied classes without at the same time allowing the revolutionary proletariat to acquire too much freedom. 86. Lenin's comments came after a roundup, in highly distilled form, of the many revolts throughout the empire leading up to the issuance of the October Manifesto. For him it was the cool, hard facts on the ground, literally, in the streets, which were decisive in explaining the regime's decision to appear to be making concessions and not, contrary to Weber, the all-powerful hand of finance capital. 87. If anyone sounded like one of the vulgar materialists he often criticized, it was Weber himself and not Lenin. 88. The issue of European finance capital allowed Weber at the very end of BDR to drop all pretenses of just writing a piece of journalism. His real vocation called. Though confined to the last of his many corpulent notes, he issued his own warning, to German finance capital: Weber's what is to be done moment. If it was hoping for a liberal outcome in Russia, it should refrain from enabling the Russian autocracy. Let the German bourgeois, who is expected to invest capital in Russian government stocks, take careful note of that. The list of arrest warrants and bans on assembly is infinitely more important for his business interests than the financial reports embellished with the aid of Russia's foreign credits. 89 As Germany's foremost social scientist, it was the best advice a Bürgerliche scholar could offer to his class to think about their long-term rather than short-term interests. Whether they could is another matter. Conclusion. Weber's 400-page essay Russlands Übergang zum Konstitutionalismus, or Russia's transition to pseudo-constitutionalism, was his last pronouncement on the 1905 revolution. It details the failure of Russia's first semblance of parliamentary democracy. Revolutionary forces were unable to overcome Nicholas's intransigence to ending his absolutist rule. Lenin spilled as much if not more ink documenting the same outcome but under more trying circumstances, the regime's ever-present sensorial machine. Their texts make for fascinating reading but not as rewarding for comparative purposes as the period when the revolution was on the ascent. 90 As political space by the end of 1907 was increasingly contracting, Lenin made his escape into exile once again, almost losing his life in the process. Weber explained at the end of his second book-length essay why we must break off this chronicle. It was shortly after Tsar Nicholas sent packing the country's first parliament, or Duma, on July 8, 1906, not unlike, again, what his distant relative had done to the Frankfurt Parliament in 1849. The dissolution of the Duma, Lenin wrote within a few days, has most strikingly and clearly confirmed the views of those who warned against being obsessed with the external constitutional aspect of the Duma and the constitutional surface of Russian politics during the second quarter of 1906-91. It was as if Lenin was speaking directly to Weber about his 400-page doorstopper. The reasons Weber gave for the break in his chronicle were that the Russian freedom struggle reveals few of the features of greatness and has a lack on both sides of really great leaders on whom the emotional interest of observers could focus. About the opposition to the regime, the tiny percentage of the population represented by the industrial proletariat can have little significance at the moment, while the ideals of the peasant lie, in spite of everything, in an unreal world. 92. Though Weber continued his interest in Russia, it clearly took a backseat to other priorities. Other than a talk in 1908 and a letter to a Russian newspaper in 1909, he had little to say about developments there. 93 The question that attracted him in the first place and the one that introduces this chapter was answered by the Tsar's proroguing of the cadet-led First Duma. Russian liberalism's moment in the sun was now history. And because Weber couldn't fathom any alternative to Russian liberals, especially an alliance of a tiny urban proletariat and peasants that Lenin campaigned for, his attention turned to other topics. Not unlike Tocqueville in the wake of another liberal failure, Weber found history more interesting than contemporary politics. Weber returned to the Russian story in 1917 in two short essays that amount to about 20 pages. 94 It was unavoidable given the revolution's origins in World War I and his nationalist core. What he had once forecast, a Romanov ending due to the tragic event of a European war, was now a reality. By not following, however, the Russian theater in the way he once had, Weber was unprepared to understand what ensued 11 years later. His last pronouncements in 1906, particularly about the lack of really great leaders on either side, and the unlikelihood that Russia's tiny industrial proletariat would be of any significance, were especially disabling. Lenin and Trotsky would later say after the Bolshevik Revolution of October 1917 that 1905, to repeat, was a dress rehearsal for 1917. Weber's more limited writings in 1917 and afterward are, however, almost devoid of any reference to his rich 1905-1906 essays except for the repeated claim that finance capital was still determinant in Russian developments. Perhaps the reason is due to his above-quoted forecasts that proved to be also wrong. But he could have justifiably claimed to have been right about Russia's liberal bourgeoisie, their failure to lead the democratic revolution. It's just that the class who did was simply not on his radar, or better, to his political liking. It is undeniable that the laboring masses who led the February Revolution produced what Lenin could rightly call the freest country in the world, certainly more so than Weber's homeland. But by 1917, in the middle of World War I, Weber's nationalist proclivities were on full display. And Weber never claimed that his values were informed by objective reality, his fact/value distinction. It's not that he couldn't see what had happened in Russia, it's that he disagreed with it in a most fundamental political way. He was, after all, a Bürgerliche scholar. One claim in the 1905 to 1906 essays would have been especially difficult to reconcile with reality after the October Revolution of 1917. If the Lenin group of social democracy was truly a sect, disdaining to strive for lasting political success, then Weber had a problem in explaining the outcome of October. The best he could come up with was that rather than the Bolsheviks he once wrote about, it was a military dictatorship, not, it is true, of generals, but of corporals that was actually in power. 95 Here, tellingly, Weber's politics trumped his scholarship. As astute an observer of social reality as Weber was, especially with regard to the peasant question, he missed what Lenin had long understood about the military. Its ranks were peopled by, as he put it in early 1917, peasants in uniform. 96 Hence, his insistence on realizing what would be his winning formula for the October Revolution, and first declared in 1905, the revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasants, the alliance Weber thought inconceivable. So, yes, Lenin might have said to Weber, there indeed was a military dictatorship in power after October, but of both peasants and workers. In his still highly regarded within academic and mainstream circles A People's Tragedy, A History of the Russian Revolution, Orlando Figes made a pregnant comment about the cadets' fall from grace, their failure to offer any meaningful resistance to Nicholas's dismissal of the First Duma in July 1906 that they led, and their subsequent rightward trajectory. Never again would the cadets place their trust in the support of the people. Nor would they claim to represent them. From this point on, they would consciously become what in fact they had been all along, the natural party of the bourgeoisie. Liberalism and the people went their separate ways. 97 But that is hindsight wisdom. In real time Lenin and Weber thought the cadets could actually lead the democratic revolution, and both acted, most important for politics especially, Lenin, on that assumption. It took Weber about a year longer than Lenin to realize the nullity of Russian liberalism. But he was politically incapable of seeing the only effective alternative to the cadets, Russia's tiny industrial proletariat in alliance with the peasantry. The richness of Weber's and Lenin's texts does not allow in a book this length and with other comparisons anything more detailed. Presented here are the most significant contrasts. I admit that significant is informed by hindsight, that is, the subsequent course of the Bolshevik project. Thus, one topic that I could be faulted for not taking up, since it would presumably, as some might argue, put Weber in better light, in terms of prescience, is that of bureaucracy. Lenin's final judgment in 1922 on his lifelong project, a bureaucratically deformed workers' state, might be reason enough. Yet, as the record would show, Lenin was not derelict in treating the topic of bureaucracy, as his last characterization of the Soviet Union suggests. It is likely, in fact, that he addressed it, despite being 6 years his junior, even before Weber. There is no evidence, I contend, should the reader inquire, that Weber was more insightful than Lenin on the topic, at least for Russia. If anything, the Soviet Union case reveals that bureaucracy, as Lenin argued, can't be fully understood separate and apart from fundamental socio-economic political reality, as Weber was prone to believe. This comparison of Lenin and Weber, two of the most influential figures of the 20th century, is not just of historical significance. Their core differences, about how best to institute and defend democracy, are at the very heart of politics today through the electoral/parliamentary arena or through the crowds in the streets. Lastly, it could be argued that comparing Weber to Lenin isn't fair, he simply wasn't the activist Lenin was. Subsequent events, however, challenge the all too often disengaged scholar image of Weber. As is true for the Marxological enterprise that has long depoliticized Marx, Weber's fans, an almost exclusively academic lot, have too virtually expunged his political activism. Maybe because it was only in his final years did Weber make a painful confession. I was born for the pen and for the speaker's platform, not for the lectern. 98 The pen referred to political journalism and not his more famous academic writings, the speaker's platform to his renowned public talks designed to shape German public opinion when World War I erupted. Like Lenin, who too was at home with the pen and speaker's platform, Weber was willing to plunge himself into the political fray but only as he understood how to do so and, not the least important, from the other side of the class divide. Appendix, from August 1914 to March 1919 Lenin vs. Weber. With the coming of the October Revolution in 1917, Lenin's and Weber's political differences were no longer confined to texts as was the case for 1905 to 1906. They were now vividly and consequentially on display on different sides of the barricades, almost literally, Lenin the proletarian internationalist and Weber the self-denominated German bourgeois nationalist scholar. The overarching context for understanding their differences was the Great War. This appendix purports only to distill the key contrasts from the commencement of the conflagration to its end, moments when Lenin and Weber both sought at the same time to shape outcomes précis for a future, possibly, comparative real-time political analysis project. Lenin's and Weber's responses to the guns of August of 1914 were, not surprisingly, diametrically opposed. Whatever the outcome, this war is great and wonderful, emphasized the Bürgerliche scholar in a letter when it commenced. 99 To the bitter end, Weber's patriotism was unwavering. Salvaging the honor of his beloved nation was the axis around which all his actions in the next 5 years orbited. His main concern was to make sure Berlin conducted the war in a way to ensure Germany's long-term imperial ambitions. We have to be a world power, and in order to have a say in the future of the world we had to risk the war. 100 Lenin, conversely, was incensed to learn that German socialists had succumbed to the patriotic fervor that Weber proudly displayed. I am extremely anxious and angry with the position of the European socialists in the present war. My conviction is that all and the German socialists first and all and chief of all got chauvinists. 101 He responded by organizing anti-war activities in Russia and planting the seeds for a new communist international, one that would seek to end the conflagration through socialist revolutions in the countries now at war. 102 The war's capitalist perpetrators, Britain, France, and Russia on one side and Germany, Austria and Italy on the other, would have to pay a price for the bloodletting. Weber's ardor for the war began to cool as it became increasingly clear that the policy makers in Berlin were increasingly toying with the idea of territorial acquisitions as the goal of the war. Needless annexations in Europe, in his opinion, would make for diplomatic obstacles for Germany becoming a world power. The need for elbow room for Germany in anticipation of National Socialism's Lebensraum that he had spoken about in his 1895 inaugural address continued to be at the center of his patriotism, but by now on a global scale. The political right and the war profiteers were now, he feared, driving war policy and, thus, jeopardizing Germany's long-term imperial interests. The solution to their undue influence, he proposed, was parliamentarization of the Reich and an accompanying necessary suffrage reform. In other words, a political system that was more representative of German public opinion, especially those in uniform who actually had to prosecute the war. Most instructive about Weber's campaign for suffrage reform is that it went into high gear in 1917 after the February/March revolution in Russia that deposed Tsar Nicholas. Along with a new provisional government, Russia's Duma, its version of a parliament, was revived. But it was rivaled by another representative institution which also reappeared, the Petrograd Soviet of Workers and Soldiers. Which of the two bodies was the legitimate authority was at the heart of the drama of the Russian Revolution and only resolved in October with Bolshevik assent. Nicholas's deposal instituted universal suffrage for the first time in Russia, making it, as Lenin put, the freest of all the belligerent countries in the world. 103 Though elections to both the Duma and the Soviet were based on universal suffrage, the latter proved to be much more representative, as its name suggests, of working class and soldier opinions. As the war's bloody toll ratcheted up, the main reason for the Tsar's fall, anti-war sentiment expressed itself more in the Soviet than in the Duma. The Bolshevik election campaign slogan, "Peace, Land, and Bread," was, hence, more popular in the latter than in the former. Lenin, not surprisingly, called for all power to the Soviets. His strategy for Russia's exit from the conflagration what essentially happened in October. Socialist revolution, in other words, was, as he had promised, Lenin's road to peace. Weber too sought to have German public opinion better represented in the policies Berlin was making, especially the voice of its soldiers. Through speeches, letters, and newspaper/magazine articles, he pushed for electoral reform. But also tellingly different from Lenin, Weber's quest for more democracy in Germany, particularly the suffrage for soldiers, was intended to strengthen the war effort, not unlike what the ruling class in Britain had just done in making universal male suffrage a reality for the first time in its domain. Weber's strategy, again, was to ensure that Germany emerged from the war in a better position to advance its global elbow room. Shoring up the war effort in Germany explains why Weber now feared what had taken place in Russia. It could be contagious. Two newspaper articles in April 1917, Russia's Transition to Pseudo-Democracy and the Russian Revolution and the Peace, consciously sought to dissuade German Social Democrats from taking seriously the significance of Tsar Nicholas's deposition. What now existed in Russia, he claimed, was pseudo-democracy, and the provisional government was as imperialist as was Nicholas's regime. Given the present composition of the Russian governing powers, there can be no question of the majority of the politically prominent men in Russia having sincerely peaceful intentions, let alone being well disposed towards the German people. Germany, therefore, was compelled to continue the war. To make his case, Weber also played the race card. The colonial subjects of the forces of the Entente powers with whom the provisional government was still allied meant that there was an army of Negroes, Gurkhas, and all the barbarian rabble in the world standing at our borders, half crazed with rage, for vengeance, and craving to devastate our country. Hence, it was absolutely necessary for the German workers to know that at the moment there can be no question of any genuine democracy in Russia, and why this is so 104, and for German workers to emulate in any way the revolutionary actions of their cohorts in Russia would be to stab the army which is protecting our country from the savage nations in the back, a charge German National Socialism would later employ to come to power. Weber ended with a challenge to the Russians: there is only one reliable test of a genuinely democratic and non-imperialist attitude. Does the politician in question restrict himself to cleaning up in his own backyard, i.e. to creating democracy within his own country, or not? 105 As Germany's leading authority on Russia, owing to his detailed analysis of the 1905 revolution, Weber's opinion had weight. Weber's critique of the provisional government's war course was strikingly similar to what Lenin was also arguing. A few weeks later, on June 17, 1917, at the First All-Russian Congress of Soviets of Workers and Soldiers, Lenin charged, like Weber, the provisional government with being beholden to Russia's capitalists, especially the war profiteers, and, thus, why they didn't want peace. He implored the Soviets to take power because they constituted a more democratic type of state than what the provisional government represented, revolutionary democracy. The war, he continued, can only be ended by taking the revolution further. If you were to take power into your hands, if power were to pass to the revolutionary organizations to be used for combating the Russian capitalists, then the working people of some countries would believe you and you could propose peace. Power transferred to the revolutionary proletariat, supported by the poor peasants, means a transition to revolutionary struggle for peace in the surest and most painless forms ever known to mankind. 106 No working people of some countries were as important for Lenin as those in Germany. The way to end the bloodbath. When he declared that the Bolsheviks were prepared to lead such a transformation, evoking both derision and applause amongst the delegates, it was as if he was responding directly to Weber's challenge. There was indeed, in other words, a politician in Russia who not only wanted to but was capable of leading Russia via the Soviets in a more thoroughgoing democratic fashion in order to end the war. But just as Weber dismissed the Bolshevik alternative in 1905 to 1906, he did the same in 1917, to his peril. He was politically incapable of conceiving a revolutionary workers' party leading a worker-slash-peasant alliance to power. His values would not allow for such a scenario, giving new meaning to his fact-slash-value distinction. He intentionally misrepresented what was underway in Russia. 107. When a majority of parties in the Reichstag, including the Social Democrats, took the initiative to put forward a peace proposal in July 1917, Weber was alarmed. He feared that they were being naively seduced by developments in Russia. Lenin's siren call. Though publicly on record in support of the parliamentarization of the German Reich, when the Reichstag actually began to assert itself with a proposal Weber objected, it would be interpreted by Germany's enemies as a sign of weakness. His public endorsement of parliamentarization and suffrage reform in Germany was, as he would have labeled it, purely instrumental to advance the war effort. Lenin might have understood Weber's calculus. He too was being instrumental. His call for all power to the Soviets was intended to deepen representative democracy in Russia, the route to peace. If Lenin wanted more democracy to end the slaughter, Weber wanted it to continue the war more effectively. When it appeared that more democracy via Reichstag assertion would threaten the war effort, in his view, because it appeared to be granted under duress, Weber, with all of the obvious contradictions, grew lukewarm if not hostile to the fledgling efforts toward democratization in Germany. Just as Lenin had promised at the Congress of Soviets in June, the Bolsheviks immediately took steps to end the war after leading the worker-peasant alliance to power in October/November 1917. Bolshevik assent allowed Weber to tack to the left. Russia was no longer an imminent threat to his beloved country, specifically because of the peace decrees issued by Moscow. He became an active advocate of suffrage reform and parliamentarization of the Reich. He headlined, along with a social democratic speaker, a mass rally in Munich in November 1917, in favor of a negotiated peace, his most public intervention yet. The radical democratic opening in Russia that the Bolsheviks led ironically made it possible for Weber to be at his progressive best. Weber and the Bolsheviks were initially on the same political page about the peace negotiations underway in the Polish town of Brest-Litovsk in December and January. A peace without annexations of the territories of other nationalities, the Bolshevik proposal, was to his liking. Unnecessary territorial acquisitions he felt would be a diplomatic obstacle to Germany becoming a real master nation. When the German negotiators began demanding exactly that, it distressed him. The culprits were the revanchist right-wing pan-German movement in combination with the Supreme Command. But his anger was confined to private communications. Defending the honor of the nation prevented him from saying so publicly. The harsh German demands prompted Leon Trotsky, who headed up the Russian delegation, to walk out of the negotiations on January 28, 1918, and to declare no war, no peace. 108. Rather than fault the German party to Brest-Litovsk, Weber blamed the Bolsheviks, Trotsky in particular, for his country's intransigence at the talks. Trotsky's revolutionary appeals to the German working class showed that he was not content to carry out this experiment in his own house and to place his hopes on the fact that, if it succeeded, it would result in unrivaled propaganda for socialism throughout the whole world. One cannot make peace with people who are fighting for their faith. One can only render them harmless, and that was the meaning of the ultimatum and the enforced peace at Brest. 109. Weber admitted in a letter that his portrait of the Bolsheviks at Brest-Litovsk was tendentious. I have only given one side of the picture in describing the Bolsheviks, the other pacifistic current is also there. Indeed, it was the pacifistic current in the Bolshevik party led by Lenin that rejected Trotsky's no war, no peace ultimatum. 2 months earlier, he was able to convince a majority of the party to sign the very onerous Brest-Litovsk Treaty that involved the ceding to Germany of major portions of what had once been the Russian Empire. Peace was needed, Lenin passionately argued, in order to consolidate the revolution, contrary to what Weber claimed. Germany's foremost social scientist consciously misrepresented, again, the Bolsheviks and in the process became an apologist for his nation's territorial aggrandizement, against his better judgment. Germany, Weber knew, would pay dearly for its rapaciousness at Brest-Litovsk, 18 months later at Versailles. 110 again, never the twain shall meet when it came to facts and values for Weber. The context for Weber's disparagement of the Bolsheviks is instructive. It's from his famous lecture, Socialism, given in June 1918 in Vienna to non-commissioned officers and rank and file in Austria's military. At the most critical juncture in the war he wanted to ensure Austria's loyalty to Berlin. Countering the Bolshevik alternative was priority number one in the lecture, thus his attack on them at Brest-Litovsk. About the talk's purported theme, I would like to begin by drawing your attention to the fact that there are socialists of the most diverse kinds. Yet, all parties of a purely socialist character are democratic parties nowadays. But democracy can mean an infinite variety of things. After showing the democratic limitations of old-style Swiss democracy, he then proceeded to take down what was widely seen as the paragon of modern democracy. This American democracy rests on the rotation of parties in and out of office, known in the US as the infamous spoils system, in which at some point everyone had a turn of putting their hands in the pork barrel. Workers, he claimed he spoke with during his visit in 1904, were aware that they were governed by these corrupt people who are notorious for robbing you of hundreds of millions. As well as being dominated by moneyed interests, US politics were also influenced by warmongers, based on, he claimed, what his 1904 visit revealed. It was the American universities and the strata educated by them, not the military contractors who exist in every country, who were the originators of the war. 111 America, like Russia, in other words, Weber's subtext, was neither to be looked to as an alternative to the then extant governing arrangements in Austria and Germany. Important to point out is that Weber, like Tocqueville, was a defender of constitutional monarchy. Only after the November Revolution, to be seen shortly, did he become a convert to republican government. Lenin, too, also instructively, pronounced on US politics, especially the contrast. Like Weber, he was aware of how money dominated its outcomes. But Lenin objected when a pro-Tsarist organ wrote about the power of money in the 1912 presidential election, relating with malicious joy the facts about the monstrous venality of Taft, Roosevelt, Wilson and, indeed, all presidential candidates put up by the bourgeois parties. Here is a free, democratic republic for you, hissed the venal Russian newspaper. Unlike what Weber implied in his socialism lecture regarding the political reality in Austria and Germany, Lenin disputed the newspaper's suggestion that the political system in the US was no better than what existed in Russia. The class-conscious workers will reply to this calmly and proudly: we have no illusions about the significance of broad democracy. No democracy in the world can eliminate the class struggle and the omnipotence of money. It is not this that makes democracy important and useful. The importance of democracy is that it makes the class struggle broad, open, and conscious. And this is not a conjecture or a wish, but a fact. 112 Superior, in other words, about the US reality, Lenin countered, was that it offered more political space for the working class needed space in order to take political power. No doubt influential in explaining Weber's legerdemain about the Bolsheviks was the outbreak of strikes in Berlin and Vienna in late January 1918. For Weber they constituted his long-dreaded fear of the Russian contagion, and about which he was not alone. The Supreme Command and the government saw the January strike as evidence that revolution à la Russe was a real possibility in Germany. 113 Weber intended his tendentious reading of the Bolshevik call for a negotiated peace to persuade German and Austrian workers to stay the course of the war. Soviet power, led by the Bolsheviks, he contended, would be no less imperialist or belligerent than the provisional government it overthrew or the Tsarist regime the latter replaced. Trotsky was a favorite target of all who smelled a Bolshevik mole. About the Berlin strike, a government official charged in the Reichstag, Trotsky had tried to make a revolution in Germany 114. What Lenin and Trotsky had been banking on since Bolshevik ascent finally occurred a year later. The long-awaited revolt of German workers on November 9, 1918, ended the reign of Wilhelm II, Europe's last major monarch, and ushered in Germany's first republic. The news was greeted with multitudinous rapture by Russia's toilers. Lenin wasn't unprepared. A month earlier, he alerted other Bolshevik leaders, "Things have so accelerated in Germany that we must not fall behind. We are ready to die to help the German workers advance the revolution which has begun in Germany." 115 Ever since the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks did all they could through propaganda efforts to stimulate something similar on German soil. Their embassy in Berlin was the headquarters for the covert operations. 116 They strove mightily, for example, to get into the hands of German soldiers President Woodrow Wilson's famous 14-point speech of January 8, 1918, in which he praised the peace initiatives of the Bolsheviks at Brest-Litovsk. Weber, too, anticipated the upheaval. But unlike Lenin, he greeted Wilhelm's demise with dread. He had tried unsuccessfully to persuade him to abdicate to make way for a constitutional monarchy rather than a republic, not his preference. Instead, he got, to his horror, a government of the Council of the People's Representatives, a version of Soviet governance but without the Bolsheviks at its head. Even with the moderate Social Democrats in the leadership, he raged against this bloody carnival that does not deserve the honorable name of a revolution. 117 He continued to defend Erich Ludendorff, Quartermaster General of the German Army, and Field Marshal General Paul von Hindenburg at the head of the Supreme Command, although he knew their overreach on the battlefield is what led to, in his opinion, the fiasco. To have criticized them in that moment would have meant, again, a stab in the back of Germany's military. Through personal contacts in Munich, he tried unsuccessfully to prevent a revolution there. 118. Forced to deal with the new reality in Germany, Weber did all he could to moderate the revolution. To that end, he was willing to collaborate with the moderate Social Democrats for good reason. The new Social Democratic Chancellor Friedrich Ebert, in his first public utterance, pleaded with the revolutionary masses in Berlin on the day of the revolt, "Fellow citizens, I urgently appeal to you, leave the streets. Maintain law and order." 119 The Ebert government offered the best guarantee against an outcome even more horrible in Weber's view, a government headed by the Spartacist League whose leaders were Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, in other words, a Bolshevik-like outcome. He didn't mince words about his opinion of the two, as he told an audience in Karlsruhe, "Liebknecht belongs in the madhouse and Rosa Luxemburg in the zoo." 120. Weber's fears weren't unfounded. The German revolt bore many similarities to the Russian overturn. Councils of workers and soldiers, as in the February Revolution, spontaneously appeared in various cities in Germany. In Berlin on November 9, workers marched under their banner, "Peace, Freedom, and Bread," unmistakably similar to the slogan that lifted the Bolsheviks to power, "Peace, Land, and Bread." Moscow's propaganda campaign for almost a year appeared to have paid off. So profound had the overturn been that even Weber served briefly on the Heidelberg Workers' and Soldiers' Council. 121. But for all the similarities, missing in Germany was a battle-tested party like the one Lenin had forged for such a moment. Beginning in 1904, Luxemburg disputed Lenin's claim that a party was needed to organize and lead a revolutionary outbreak. Lenin's oft-disparaged vanguard party, the moment itself, Luxemburg claimed, would spontaneously organize such a party. Lenin vehemently disagreed, but that was now water under the bridge. From afar and with state power, he did all he could to aid and abet the fledgling party, first the Spartacist League, and then, the German Communist Party, when founded on December 30, 1918. Weber, on the other hand, as previously noted, was no admirer of Liebknecht and Luxemburg. He continued to disparage the two and their organization even after their assassination on January 15, 1919, probably on orders of the Ebert Social Democratic government with which he had once collaborated. Though he denounced their murders, he came close to blaming them for their own deaths in his famous lecture, The Profession and Vocation of Politics, in Munich shortly afterward. Have we not seen that the Bolshevik and Spartacist ideologues, precisely because they use this political instrument, bring about exactly the same results as any militarist dictator? 122. In other words, with a quote from the Bible, all they that take the sword shall perish with the sword. As well, he now felt emboldened to discredit the new governing institution that emerged in the November Revolution. What, apart from the identity of the holders of power, distinguishes the rule of the workers' and soldiers' councils from the rule of any wielder of power under the old regime? What the Bolsheviks had instituted, in other words, was no different from previous regimes. For Lenin, however, the deaths of Liebknecht and Luxemburg was a blow, the most dramatic and tragic event in the revolution beginning in Germany. 123. In hindsight, their loss spelled the end of the November Revolution. Weber eventually came to support a Republican Germany. Revolutionary Germany made him a convert, not unlike Tocqueville in 1848.124. Republican Germany was preferable to a Soviet Germany. In so doing, he entered active party politics, helping to found in 1919 the German Democratic Party, a bourgeois party. He was simply acting on his long-held conviction that Germany's future rested on its capitalist class. His political career was, however, short-lived. Germany's most eminent scholar could never find it in himself to master the art of being a politician. The revolutionary situation in Germany made Weber less influential. Wolfgang Mommsen argues persuasively that he was best suited for the Germany Bismarck helped put in place. 125. His premature death in 1920 due to tuberculosis saved him from being seen so out of place in the cataclysmic developments that then ensued. From the collapse of the Brest-Litovsk talks at the end of January 1918 to the end of the November Revolution in March 1919, Lenin and Weber actively opposed one another from different sides of the barricades, almost literally. The assassinations of Liebknecht and Luxemburg at the end of January 1919 effectively meant that they had fought to a standstill. Weber was certainly aware of his opponent's actions. Whether Lenin knew about Weber's efforts is uncertain. But he would not have been surprised. 2 years earlier Lenin characterized Weber's portrait of the Bolsheviks in the dress rehearsal of 1905 as a piece of professorial wisdom of the cowardly bourgeoisie. Weber's dismissal of the Bolsheviks, not only in 1905 but in 1917 as well, handicapped his ability to spar effectively with his formidable class enemy. In Adam Tooze's otherwise informative account about these years, Weber makes only one appearance. The great sociologist, one of the most penetrating political commentators of the day, is applauded for having understood the lasting damage done to Germany's political culture by Bismarck. 126. The point is in reference to the inordinate role the military supreme command had come to play in the Reich. But it's telling that Tooze has nothing more to say about one of the most penetrating commentators of the day. It's because he knows all too well the counter-revolutionary and most problematic, to put it charitably, role Weber played in the drama between August 1914 and the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. 127. To reveal that story might suggest that in comparison to Weber, Lenin had better democratic credentials, the last thing Tooze would ever want to do. Wilson represents a bourgeoisie which has made billions out of the war. Lenin, January 1917. Here is the ever-recurring question. How shall we deal with the Bolsheviki? Wilson, January 1918. Max Weber was prescient when he wrote in 1905 about the prospects for the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty in Russia. Only in the tragic event of a European war would the autocracy finally be destroyed. Weber wasn't the first to speculate on how a war of such magnitude and developments in Russia could be interrelated. Friedrich Engels raised that possibility in 1888. Revolution in Russia at this moment would save Europe from the horrors of a general war and would usher in universal social revolution too. He returned to the issue 3 years later. If war is to break out, one thing is certain. This war, in which 15 to 20 million armed men would slaughter one another and devastate Europe as it has never been devastated before. This war would either lead to the immediate triumph of socialism, or it would lead to such an upheaval in the old order of things, it would leave behind it everywhere such a heap of ruins, that the old capitalist society would become more impossible than ever, and the social revolution, set back by 10 or 15 years, would only be all the more radical and more rapidly implemented. Point 3. Engels, as events would show, proved to be more foresighted than Weber. The Great War, or World War I, inaugurated an era that continues to resonate a century later. The most consequential of its products was doubtless the Russian Revolution of 1917. First, the February/March edition, and second, the Bolshevik-led revolution in October/November. Point 4. The fate of the war, how long it would last after 2.5 years of feudal carnage, became inextricably linked to those two momentous outcomes. No one was as conscious of that fact and did more to act on it than Vladimir Lenin. The world's most powerful actor also came to recognize that developments in Russia would be determinant for World War I, more specifically, its duration. When President Woodrow Wilson of the U.S. eventually decided, after more than 2 years of official neutrality toward the war, that U.S. ruling class interests were better served by siding with the Entente coalition Britain, France, and Russia against the Central Powers Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy, he faced a problem. As long as the Romanovs were a key member of the alliance, it was difficult to sell the Entente to the U.S. public. Once overthrown, however, in February/March 1917, Wilson's task became easier. Making the world safe for democracy was more credible without Europe's last absolutist dynasty in tow. But what about the Bolsheviks when they came to power later in October/November, led arguably by Marx's and Engels's ablest student? Would Wilson continue to be enthusiastic about the Russian Revolution as he had when it began in February/March 1917? Would Lenin and the Bolsheviks aid and abet his project to make America the beacon of liberal internationalism? Thus began a fascinating and underappreciated drama that lasted for almost 3 years. That is the focus of this chapter. Unlike in the 3 prior cases, the 2 protagonists compared in this chapter, Lenin and Wilson, not only read the same events in real time but knew, as well, how each other was responding to them, including, most importantly, the actions of each other. At stake were consequences of world historical significance. Both were engaged in a high-wire act, Lenin especially, and understood to varying degrees that their pas de deux entailed dangers that could be fatal. This makes for a truly unique moment in the history of ideas and real-time political analysis. Point 5. That the archival record is more definitive, certainly in Wilson's case, makes for a comparison more robust than the 3 other cases. Point 6. Thus, another opportunity to compare and contrast a Marxist and liberal worldview to determine which had a more accurate reading of arguably the most consequential set of events of the last century. Prelude to the February Revolution, Lenin. By the time Tsar Nicholas was overthrown on February-March 27, 1917, Russia had been at war for more than 2.5 years. The estimated dead and wounded were in the millions. Russia's masses were generally supportive when Nicholas declared war on Austria and Germany on July-August 19, 1914, in response to German Emperor Wilhelm II's declaration a day earlier, the opening of the Guns of August, the Great War or World War I. The Bolsheviks were virtually alone in waging an active but futile anti-war effort, at least for the first 2 years of the conflagration. They were acting as they saw it, in conformity with the lessons Marx and Engels had bequeathed. The working men have no country, one of the most memorable lines in the manifesto of the Communist Party that Marx and Engels wrote for the Communist League in 1848, was accompanied at the very end with probably the document's most quoted sentence: "Working men of all countries, unite." 2 decades would pass before those 2 lines, the essence of what would come to be called proletarian internationalism, gained currency. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 required Marx and Engels to put proletarian internationalism to the test for the first time, to see if workers could be recruited to an anti-war course when their ruling classes embarked on wars that didn't advance the interests of the proletariat. The U.S. revealed that some wars, specifically, for national self-determination and the overthrow of pre-capitalist social systems like chattel slavery, could actually do just that, distinguishing Marxists from pacifists, and thus the need for theoretical and political clarity. Written on behalf of the International Working Men's Association, the First International, that he effectively headed, Marx's first and second addresses on the war called for, first, a working-class anti-war response to the war drive in France and Germany and, second, opposition, particularly for German workers, to any territorial aggrandizement on the part of Bismarck, specifically, Alsace-Lorraine. Mass distribution of the two pronouncements not only in the belligerent countries but beyond was a distinctive and unprecedented feature of the anti-war campaign. Along with that effort, the use of the parliamentary podium by working-class parties, particularly in Germany, to denounce the war and lead the opposition to it, a model Lenin emulated in revolutionary Russia. Most prophetically, Marx wrote that the annexation of Alsace-Lorraine by Germany could provoke Russian intervention on behalf of France, and a German-Russian war would then act as the midwife for the inevitable social revolution in Russia. 7. If the arithmetic was wanting in terms of timing, the algebra was nonetheless elegant. Exactly what happened 5 decades later. With Marx's death in 1883, it fell largely to Engels to lead on the war question for the workers' movement. He foresaw and criticized, as quoted in the introduction to this chapter, the increasing militarization drive on the part of the major European powers and warned about the expected carnage. War, again, was not inevitable. Revolutionary action on the part of Europe's working classes could prevent such a slaughter. 5 years after Engels's death in 1895, leaders of various working-class parties inspired by him and his partners' project launched what would become the Socialist or Second International. At their annual meetings, delegates of party affiliates took up the question of militarism, how to counter it with a working-class rather than liberal pacifist response, as was often the case with rival formations. The gathering in Basel, Switzerland, 2 years prior to the Guns of August proved to have been the most portent. The now famous Basel Manifesto of 1912, which passed unanimously, and in the context of the Balkan War of 1912 to 1913, appealed to fraternal parties and members to raise your protest in the parliaments with all your force, unite in great mass demonstrations, use every means that the organization and the strength of the proletariat place at your disposal. See to it that the governments are constantly kept aware of the vigilance and passionate will for peace on the part of the proletariat. To the capitalist world of exploitation and mass murder, oppose in this way the proletarian world of peace and fraternity of peoples. 8. Raise your protest in the parliaments. Most noteworthy, asked party affiliates who had members in such bodies, to do just that should war break out. At the heart of the manifesto was a threat: make war, bourgeois gentlemen, and your working classes will make revolution. War against war, as the threat became known. The opening sentences of the document were unambiguous, as made clear by the emboldened clauses in the original. In case war should break out anyway, it is their duty to intervene in favor of its speedy termination and with all their powers to utilize the economic and political crisis created by the war to arouse the people and thereby to hasten the downfall of capitalist class rule. Threats, as always, are only effective if they appear to be realizable. Only one of the signatories to the Basel Manifesto made good on the threat. The Bolshevik faction of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party led by Vladimir Lenin had a long record going back to the revolution of 1905 of trying to convert dynastic predatory wars, the 1904 to 1905 Russo-Japanese War specifically, into a civil war, that is, the overthrow of their own regime. The 1912 to 1913 Balkan War gave them another opportunity to try again. But increasingly irritated by Bolshevik efforts to thwart Tsar Nicholas's pan-Slavic war agenda in the mountainous tinderbox, the regime squashed in early summer 1914 the publication of their daily, Pravda. The clampdown, in hindsight, was a prelude to Nicholas's most fateful decision: declaration of war on Austria-Hungary and Germany on July-August 19, 1914. Of the parties that signed the 1912 Basel Manifesto, the parliamentary deputies of only 2 Socialist International affiliates carried out what the signatories had pledged, the 11 in Russia's Duma, or parliament, 5 Bolsheviks and 6 Mensheviks and the 2 Serbian Social Democrats in their parliament. Rather than go along with voting for war credits to finance the slaughter about to take place, they refused and walked out. The parliamentary deputies of the vast majority of the signatories, on the other hand, with the German party in the lead, voted for war credits. Lenin would forever insist that those parties betrayed the Basel Declaration and, hence, proletarian internationalism. 9. As the Basel Manifesto had required, the 5 Bolshevik deputies, with Lenin in the lead but in exile with all the logistical challenges that entailed for coordinating the work, used their parliamentary immunity to campaign against the war. They spoke publicly, when possible, against the war and distributed anti-war propaganda in a cat-and-mouse game with the regime's police. Lenin wrote a set of theses for them to campaign on. All were consistent with the manifesto and Marxist fundamentals. 1, however, number 6, seemed exceptional. From the viewpoint of the working class and the toiling masses of all the people of Russia, the defeat of the Tsarist monarchy and its army would be the lesser evil by far. 10. Lenin, in other words, took proletarian internationalism so seriously that he was willing to risk patriotic opprobrium by calling for the defeat of the Tsarist forces. Bolsheviks, he argued, should wage a campaign, including amongst Russian troops, for what came to be called revolutionary defeatism. For the proletariat of the aggressor nation to be convincing in calling on the proletariat of the aggrieved nations to practice proletarian internationalism, it had to make clear, in no uncertain terms, its disinterest in defending the fatherland, what some Marxists called revolutionary defensism. Not surprisingly, Lenin's call was not popular even amongst many Bolsheviks. He was clearly in the minority on this. But it was a strategy that began to pay off as the body count on the battlefield mounted inexorably. Revolutionary defeatism was the unpardonable sin of the Bolsheviks in the eyes of Nicholas's regime treason. It now had a smoking gun for the arrest of the 5 Bolsheviks deputies in 1915. Their trial, however, Lenin wrote, had unintended consequences for the regime. Thanks to the trial, the words cited in the indictment, the guns should be directed, not against our brothers, the wage slaves of other countries, but against the reactionary and bourgeois governments and parties of all countries. These words will spread and have already done so all over Russia as a call for proletarian internationalism, for the proletarian revolution. Thanks to the trial, the class slogan of the vanguard of the workers of Russia has reached the masses of the workers. 11. The trial and its coverage in the press did more to publicize the anti-war/proletarian internationalist stance of the Bolsheviks than anything prior to then, enabling what they would do 2 years later. With the Bolshevik deputies now imprisoned and, thus, no longer able to do open anti-war work inside Russia, Lenin turned his attention to the international scene. If the majority of parties in the Socialist International had betrayed proletarian internationalism, then it was time to build a new international. Taking its name from the Swiss town where it first met in 1915, the Zimmerwald movement soon found enough like-minded forces, including in the German party and one-time foes of Lenin like Leon Trotsky and Rosa Luxemburg. The axis around which they united was the call to workers in the belligerent countries to turn the war into a civil war, that is, against their own bourgeois governments, just as the Basel Manifesto had demanded. It was in this context, in April 1916, that Lenin first pointed to the anti-war sentiment inside the US. Even there, in a neutral country, 2 irreconcilably hostile trends in the Socialist Party have become revealed. On the one hand, the adherents of the so-called preparedness, i.e., war, militarism, and navalism, and on the other, socialists like Eugene Debs, former presidential candidate from the Socialist Party, who openly preaches civil war for socialism, precisely in connection with the coming war. 12. The significance of Lenin's point, a civil war for socialism in the US, would become clear 2 years later. Lenin's anti-war campaign required a theoretical explanation for World War I. Thus, his 1916 classic Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. The war, he argued, was imperialist on the part of both sides. It was a war for the division of the world, for the partition and repartition of colonies and spheres of influence of finance, capital, etc. Such wars, he added, were absolutely inevitable under such an economic system, as long as private property in the means of production exists, that is, the capitalist mode of production. Point 13 to be noted is that these lines were penned for a later introduction to the book, written in July 1920, that is, after the war. He stressed, however, that his claim about the origins of the war wasn't hindsight. With an eye to the Tsarist censorship, he had to couch his argument in language I had to speak in a slavish tongue seemingly non-threatening to the censors. But a close reading of imperialism leaves no doubt that for Lenin the logic of the capitalist mode of production ushered in an epoch of unprecedented warfare, global conflagrations. If the interests of workers could be served by wars of liberation for oppressed nationalities or of republican against monarchical regimes, imperialist wars had nothing to offer the proletariat. They were to be opposed to the hilt. That claim, more than any other, informed his actions not only for the next 2 years, the focus of this chapter, but also for the rest of his life. Adam Tooze argues that the logic of Lenin's imperialism meant that Washington must sooner or later declare war on Germany. 14 But nowhere did Lenin say that. Economics for Lenin was always mediated by politics, specifically, the class struggle. The example of Debs showed that there was working class opposition in the US to Washington sending troops to Europe. Therefore, it wasn't inevitable that President Woodrow Wilson would intervene, trying to dissuade him by widening and deepening that anti-war sentiment through the proletarian internationalist campaign of the Zimmerwald movement. Was the real Lenin. This was arguably Lenin's first effort to influence Wilson's actions. Sensing that war weariness was setting in on both sides, Lenin warned fellow socialists in early January 1917, to be wary of pious phrases about peace from any bourgeois governments. Buying into such talk could lead to socialist pacifism in alliance with bourgeois pacifism. Lenin was referring to Wilson's December 18, 1916, peace note, an offer to begin possible mediation as a neutral nation, between the two warring alliances. 15 But, Lenin countered. Wilson's pronouncement is a downright lie and sheer hypocrisy, because Wilson represents a bourgeoisie which has made billions out of the war, because he is the head of a government that has frantically armed the United States, obviously in preparation for a second great imperialist war. 16. This was Lenin's first extended comment about Wilson in relation to the war. The article in which he wrote these lines, originally intended for a Russian exile publication in New York, was not published until 1924, after the death of both of them. Thus, Wilson probably never knew what Lenin really thought of him, possibly to Lenin's advantage, as events would show. Lenin's bottom line, again, was that only if the war became a civil war, with workers turning their weapons against their own bourgeoisie and taking power, could there be any chance for a democratic peace. If not, the outcome would be an imperialist peace, ensuring, then, a second great imperialist war. Lenin didn't live long enough to learn how tragically prescient he had been. A few weeks before the February/March Revolution, Lenin told an audience of revolutionary workers in Zurich, Switzerland, in a talk on the 12th anniversary of the beginning of the 1905 Russian Revolution, that the history of the Russian Revolution, like the history of the Paris Commune of 1871, teaches us the incontrovertible lesson that militarism can never and under no circumstances be defeated and destroyed, except by a victorious struggle of one section of the national army against the other section. It is not sufficient simply to denounce, revile, and repudiate militarism. It is foolish peacefully to refuse to perform military service. The task is to keep the revolutionary consciousness of the proletariat tense and train its best elements, not only in a general way, but concretely, so that when popular ferment reaches the highest pitch, they will put themselves at the head of the revolutionary army. 17. Regarding the Russian Revolution, Lenin no doubt had in mind a crucial moment in the 1905 upheaval when, as he then wrote, an important unit of the armed forces of Tsarism, has openly gone over to the side of the Revolution 18 Revolutionary Civil War, in other words, was what he was advocating exactly the course he charted for the next 9 months. He had no idea as he spoke how soon he would have the opportunity to realize that goal with a single-mindedness informed by all of the preceding. Prelude to the February Revolution, Wilson. As head of the most powerful state on the planet, Woodrow Wilson would too, as Lenin's critique of his December 18, 1916, peace note, suggests, become a protagonist in the destiny of the Great War, in fact, the leading one. Wilson, unlike Weber or John Stuart Mill, was the rare intellectual/academic, at least from that era, who subordinated his life to politics. Underappreciated, however, is that he chose an academic career in order to become a political figure, not unlike Tocqueville, making, therefore, for a fairer comparison with Lenin. 19 Once the guns of August exploded in 1914, Wilson's actions, however, were uninformed by as rich a tradition as the one Lenin 14 years his junior drew on to both make sense of and to respond to the war. From the other side of the class divide, he would have to innovate with consequences that reverberate until today. Wilson was the first and, until now, only U.S. president to be doctored, from Johns Hopkins, in history and political science. He taught at 3 prestigious colleges, including Princeton, and published 10 books, one of which was a popular biography of George Washington, and a 5-volume history of the U.S. From 1902 to 1910 he served as Princeton's president. His academic renown earned him the presidency of the American Political Science Association from 1909 to 1910. The American politics subfield of the just emerging discipline of political science traces its origins to Wilson. No president before or since Wilson has had such sterling academic and intellectual credentials. Noteworthy, however, is that his scholarship was strikingly bereft, especially for a political scientist, of any sustained attention to international politics, the subject for which his presidency would be most remembered. The Academy was a stepping stone, unusual in U.S. politics, to Wilson's first publicly elected post as the governor of New Jersey from 1911 to 1913, from where he captured national attention. Key to understanding how Wilson would respond to the Great War is that his family was on the losing side of the most sanguinary but consequential conflict in the 19th century. He was 9 years old, living in prostrate Georgia when Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox, Virginia, in April 1865. His father had been a Presbyterian chaplain for the defeated Confederate Army, and his mother had attended to its wounded soldiers. The U.S. Civil War, always to be remembered, claimed more American lives than all the wars the U.S. has since fought in. The fact that it was a bloody Revolutionary War would forever, Adam Tooze argues, mark Wilson not unlike how the French Revolution marked Alexis de Tocqueville. 20 If Marx, Engels, and Lenin regarded the Civil War as an advance for world humanity, Wilson emphatically did not. An essay by Edmund Burke, the eminent British conservative critic of the French Revolution, offered intellectual ammunition for Wilson to hone his arguments about the ills of revolutions in an 1893 essay. 21 If Tocqueville was responsible for the sanitization of the First American Revolution, his preferred alternative to the bloodletting in his native France, Wilson, given his intellectual cum political stature, was probably most responsible for the defanging of the Second, the Civil War, and reconstruction of its revolutionary content. Bloody revolutions were, in the tradition of Burke and Tocqueville, un-American. 22 Marx and Engels. Lenin too to be seen shortly thought otherwise. The Spanish-American War, 1898 to 1901, instantiated for Lenin his thesis about the new epoch in the capitalist mode of production, imperialism. The war's outcome is what first got Wilson's attention about U.S. foreign policy. With no apparent interest in why and how it was done, almost accidental. 23 The U.S. now possessed former Spanish territories including the Philippines and Puerto Rico. While he, not an imperialist of expansionism, 24 would have preferred that the U.S. not become a colonial power, my personal wish 25 was better that it get the Philippines than Germany or Russia, our greatest rivals, inasmuch as hers was the light of day, while theirs was the light of darkness. 26 Practicality rather than theory demanded that the U.S. government face up to its responsibilities and try to be an enlightened colonial authority. But that didn't mean savages. 27 could adopt institutions that came with the colonial project because, as Burke had advised, they weren't part of their traditions. Be especially wary, he warned, of freedom for the undisciplined Filipinos. 28 Particularly, the Filipino rebels. 29 Governing colonial subjects required compliance, law and order, the incessant mantra of more seasoned colonial powers. After all, they are children and we are men in these deep matters of government and justice. 30. After 3 years of U.S. occupation of the Philippines, Wilson was less the idealist and more the realist. As an address in late November of 1903 reveals, it may be that politicians in Washington had their own selfish interests to serve in bringing us to blows with Spain and in sweeping the foreign dominions of the Spanish crown under our own rule, but the consciences of the vast majority of us are void of offense in that great matter. 31 And for the first time he suggested how he personally felt about the war. We know that our pulses beat high in that war because we truly believed ourselves to be defending peoples who are trodden upon and degraded by corrupt and selfish governors. If the Civil War may have once made Wilson squeamish about war, the booty America acquired in besting corrupt and selfish Spain seems to have convinced him that war could actually have noble ends. His new realism about the U.S. as a colonial power was clearly on display in a presentation at the end of January 1904. With the Philippines as the new western frontier of the U.S., it could serve as prior frontiers had done, a place to turn loose the colts of the race. Then, an instructive next sentence, because of our Americanism we had no patience with anti-imperialist weepings and wailings that came out of Boston, we knew that the time had come for men to look out of dry eyes and see the world as it is. And in justifying a more robust American colonial project, he concluded, we are a sort of pure air blowing in world politics, destroying illusions and cleaning places of morbid miasmatic gases. 32 No sentiment anticipated more his response to the Great War a decade later. Finally, when the secretary of the New York Anti-Imperialist League asked Wilson to sign on to a letter calling for independence for the Philippines, he respectfully declined, I do not think the movement in favor of Philippine independence either wise or opportune. 33 The rejection anticipated policies Wilson would pursue a decade later as U.S. President. Like the rest of the world, Washington too was shaken when the guns of August of 1914 exploded 4 days into that fateful month and year. The 18-month-old Wilson administration wasn't totally unprepared since its fabled advisor, Colonel Edward House, had visited the capitals of the belligerents prior to then to see if armed conflict could be avoided. Unlike Lenin, Wilson seems never to have had a thought-out explanation for the war. At the most it was a quarrel to settle economic rivalries between Germany and England, superficially akin to Lenin's imperialism thesis. 34 When House told him 4 years later that he thought the two great causes of war were territorial and commercial greed, he apparently agreed or made no argument against. 35 Whatever the case, Wilson issued on August 19 the Declaration of Neutrality because the people of the United States are drawn from many nations, now at war. To take sides would be divisive and, hence, fatal to our peace of mind. It would also make it hard for Washington to play the part of impartial mediation to end the war. Neutrality no doubt suited Wilson's personal preferences owing to his basic belief that the belligerents, the Entente on one side, Britain, France, Russia, and Italy, and the Central Powers on the other, Germany, Austria, Turkey and Bulgaria, constituted the morbid miasmatic gases of the past, a plague, hence, on both their houses. He hoped to prove that America could be the alternative to old world realities, again, a sort of pure air blowing in world politics. To make clear that the American alternative wasn't starry-eyed idealism, Wilson intervened with U.S. troops in Mexico's 1913-1916 Civil War, in the name of protecting American lives. He threatened to occupy northern Mexico to the consternation of pacifists who tried unsuccessfully to get Wilson to reconsider his actions, including the future defender of the Bolshevik Revolution, John Reed. 36 As Wilson had stated in 1903, he would have no truck with anti-imperialist weepings and wailings. Only because the victorious side in the Civil War was willing to concede to his demands did he not carry out his threat. Similarly, he operated in an admittedly high-handed way in imposing with our Marines a treaty on the dusky little Republic of Haiti in 1915. The pretext was another intra-ruling class conflict on the island. To not intervene would leave the best and most responsible Haitians prey to the most sordid chaos. The treaty, to be in place for at least a decade, would give us practically complete control of the finances of the Haitian government. 37 The island's major creditor, City National Bank in New York, would be the main financial beneficiary of the stability Washington imposed. Despite official neutrality, Wilson embarked on a campaign that came to be called preparedness, mentioned above in Lenin's comment about Eugene V. Debs. Launched in New York on November 4, 1915, he stated that the Great War in Europe had raised the question how far we are prepared to maintain ourselves against any interference with our national action or development, to be prepared, not for war, but only for defense. 38 A month later in his State of the Union address to Congress he spelled out his defense proposals. U.S. interventions in the Philippines, Hawaii, Mexico, Puerto Rico, and Haiti taught that the regular army of 108,008 needed to be increased to 141,843 plus increases in various support units. And in order to be ready to assert some part of its real power promptly and upon a larger scale, should occasion arise, Wilson proposed supplementing the army by a force of 400,000 disciplined citizens, raised in increments of 133,000 a year throughout a period of 3 years. At least so much by way of preparation for defense seems to me to be absolutely imperative now. We cannot do less. The Navy too, our first and chief line of defense, Wilson argued, needed major upgrading. He proposed the construction within 5 years of 10 battleships, 6 battle cruisers, 10 scout cruisers, 50 destroyers, 15 fleet submarines, 85 coast submarines, 4 gunboats, 1 hospital ship, 2 ammunition ships, 2 fuel oil ships, 1 repair ship. But, Wilson pointedly noted, armies and instruments of war are only part of what has to be considered if we are to consider the supreme matter of national self-sufficiency and security in all its aspects. Trade and commerce were crucially important. U.S. economic independence required its own merchant marine fleet. And while private capital must undertake and achieve that goal, the government must assume the initial financial risks, it should take the first steps, and should take them at once. 39 Thus, at the very moment Lenin was researching and writing his Imperialism, highest stage of capitalism, Wilson was launching an unprecedented campaign to advance the global reach of U.S. capital. Ideological preparedness was also required. Wilson lambasted those professing to be the voices of Americans which were not indeed and in truth American, but which spoke alien sympathies, which came from men who loved other countries better than they loved America, men who were partisans of other causes than that of America and had forgotten that their chief and only allegiance was to the great government under which they live. 40 Wilson was vague about who were these citizens of the United States, born under other flags, have formed plots to destroy property, they have entered into conspiracies against the neutrality of the government. He was probably, as a subsequent speech revealed, referring to radical pro-German nuclei in the U.S. To Congress he said, "We are without adequate federal laws to deal with it. I urge you to enact such laws at the earliest possible moment." 41 Wilson's call in hindsight initiated the nation's first xenophobic dragnet, in anticipation of the Red Scare. Whether he was consciously preparing for U.S. intervention into the Great War with his call for an unprecedented increase in the nation's military capabilities and the enactment of legislation that would be used to stifle domestic opposition to an intervention will probably never be known, but objectively that's exactly what he was doing. Wilson's public and private utterances suggest someone who could be self-deceiving, telling not only others, but himself what he wanted to hear. To carry out his military buildup, Wilson had to overcome widespread anti-war, anti-interventionist, Anti-militarism and pacifist sentiment. What Lenin's above-mentioned comment about Debs and the debates in the Socialist Party about the war alluded to. Wilson's Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, not only a well-known Democrat but probably the country's leading pacifist, resigned his post, in fact, in June 1915, when he thought Wilson was veering too far away from neutrality in favor of the Entente powers. To win public support for his preparedness program, Wilson embarked on an 8-state speaking tour in January and February 1916 with particular focus on the Midwest where opposition to his proposals was strongest. Pro-preparedness rallies were organized in other cities, especially in the West, and were often greeted with protests by anti-war activists, sometimes leading to violence. Anti-militarist activists responded quickly to his proposals with mass meetings, some of the biggest in the Twin Cities, Minnesota, obliging Wilson to invite their leaders to the White House for a colloquy on May 8, 1916, to clarify the discussion. 42 An unidentified participant at the very end of the encounter suggested to Wilson that his proposals would only embolden our economic organizations that are more active, more powerful, in reaching out and grasping for the world's trade. That, he continued, would lead to an aggressive nationalism in trade which would, when Wilson interrupted, it might, very easily, unless some check was placed upon it by some international arrangement which we hope for. To which another unidentified voice added, if they get the educational thing with it. I quite see your point, the professorial Wilson concluded the session with, according to the transcript. Point 43 thus, for the problem someone might have posed who had read the manuscript Lenin soon published. Imperialism, that is, how to curb the innately predatory character of capital and the global war drive it generates. Wilson's solution was some kind of international arrangement in anticipation not only of his beloved League of Nations but other post-World War I and World War II arrangements. For his re-election campaign in the summer and fall of 1916, Wilson ran on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," despite the fact that U.S. troops were battling revolutionary forces in Mexico at the same time. With the active support of pacifists like Bryan and the American Federation of Labor leader Samuel Gompers, he was able to win by a slim margin over his more pro-preparedness Republican and officially anti-intervention Socialist Party rivals. Though his electoral college vote was much smaller than what it had been in his 1912 victory, Wilson's popular vote totals suggest that a majority of the electorate favored his official neutrality stance. The more revolutionary forces in the working class movement like Debs, however, thought like Lenin that Wilson had been duplicitous about his real aims. Point 44 More evidence for their suspicions was his formation during the campaign of a Council of National Defense, because a country is best prepared for war which is best prepared for peace. Consisting of leading figures in the private sector, including Gompers, its charge was to render possible in time of need the immediate concentration and utilization of the resources of the nation. 45. With the electoral victory safely under his belt, Wilson launched a new peace initiative, his previously mentioned peace note of December 18, 1916. Again, he offered to serve as a possible mediator for the belligerents, but with the understanding that a long-term solution was needed, a League of Nations to ensure peace and justice throughout the world. The U.S., he pointed out, had a stake in the end of the conflagration, the situation of neutral nations now exceedingly hard to endure. 46 Wilson was satisfied with the response of the Entente powers to his initiative except for one of them. President and advisers, according to Britain's ambassador in Washington, are particularly anxious about the Russian situation, fearing that power has gone back into the hand of the reactionaries. 47. Wilson informed Congress on January 22, 1917, about his initiative. The responses of the belligerents indicated that we are much nearer a definite discussion of peace to end the war and a discussion of the international concert which will make it virtually impossible that any such catastrophe should ever overwhelm us again. And famously, it must be a peace without victory, a peace between equals. In conclusion, speaking for liberals and friends of humanity in every nation and of every program of liberty, I am proposing that no nation should seek to extend its polity over any other nation or people, but that every people should be left free to determine its own polity. I am proposing government by the consent of the governed. 48. On that very same day Lenin lambasted social pacifists for being foolish to expect a democratic peace from bourgeois governments that are waging an imperialist predatory war. He did so in the same aforementioned talk he gave in Zurich, Switzerland, in which he argued that the only counter to militarism is the victorious struggle of one section of the national army against the other section, exactly why he so vehemently opposed pacifism of any variety. He ended with a forecast: we must not be deceived by the present grave-like stillness in Europe. Europe is pregnant with revolution. The monstrous horrors of the imperialist war, the suffering caused by the high cost of living everywhere engender a revolutionary mood, and the ruling classes, the bourgeoisie and its servitors, the governments, are more and more moving into a blind alley from which they can never extricate themselves without tremendous upheavals. Lenin clearly didn't realize the imminence of his forecast to his mostly youthful audience when he said, "We of the older generation may not live to see the decisive battles of this coming revolution." 49. From February to November 1917. When Germany announced on February 1, 1917, that its submarines would fire on all ships in the war zone, Wilson decided to break off diplomatic relations with Berlin. The discovery of a secret diplomatic telegram that Berlin was considering a maneuver with Mexico at the expense of the U.S. was also portentous. And when 3 U.S. merchant marine ships were sunk on March 18, he came under increasing pressure to abandon official U.S. neutrality and to declare war on Germany. 3 days earlier a development took place that would weigh heavily in the momentous decision he was about to make. Wilson's fear that power has gone back into the hand of the reactionaries in Russia proved to be unwarranted. It was in fact just the opposite. Until March 15, Tsar Nicholas's regime had been Exhibit A for the morbid miasmatic gases of the past that had once been Wilson's characterization of Europe. The sclerotic 300-year-old dynasty came to an ignominious end that day when Russia's long-suffering subjects became its protagonists. Both Lenin and Wilson were ecstatic with Nicholas's disposal after more than a week of mass protests, but for quite different reasons. To a cabinet meeting on March 23, Wilson hoped that the Russian Revolution was permanent. "It ought to be good," said Wilson with a smile, "because it has a professor at the head." He was especially pleased that America was the first nation to recognize the new Russian government. 50. About 2 weeks later, Lenin, about to make his way back to Russia, wrote a farewell letter to Swiss workers on behalf of the Bolshevik Central Committee in exile. The objective circumstances of the imperialist war make it certain that the revolution will not be limited to the first stage of the Russian Revolution, that the revolution will not be limited to Russia. The German proletariat is the most trustworthy, the most reliable ally of the Russian and the world proletarian revolution. 51. No two lines foretold as much as these Lenin's course for the next 2 to 3 years. Like Wilson, he too wanted a permanent Russian revolution, but in a profoundly different way. At the heart of Lenin and Wilson's differences, as first revealed in that moment and in anticipation of their fraught pas de deux the next 2 years or more, is that while both saw the February/March revolution as a bourgeois revolution, for Lenin, unlike Wilson, it was, while necessary, only the means to an end, the socialist revolution. For Wilson the bourgeois democratic revolution was the end. Their differences had a rich genealogy going back to the 1848 to 1849 revolutions. Liberals, as epitomized by Tocqueville, wanted to limit the revolution, while Marxists, as the Communist Manifesto put it, wanted to ensure that the bourgeois revolution be but the prelude to an immediately following proletarian revolution, and with all that implied internationally. What the Marxist project was unable to do in 1848 to 1849 it could 7 decades later in the hands of its most able student. In his speech to a joint session of Congress on April 2, in which he asked for its approval for declaring war on Germany, Wilson sought to explain why the long-avoided outcome had come to be. A steadfast concert for peace can never be maintained except by a partnership of democratic nations. No autocratic government could be trusted to keep faith within it or observe its covenants. The reign of autocracy in Germany, in other words, is what forced, he claimed, the US out of its position of neutrality. Only democratic governments could be counted on for maintaining the peace. The first application of the thesis of the democratic peace in a major policy statement. Point 52. From a solemn tone, Wilson then struck for the first time in the speech an optimistic note. Does not every American feel that assurance has been added to our hope for the future peace of the world by the wonderful and heartening things that have been happening within the last few weeks in Russia? Unlike in Germany, the Russian people had just discarded the autocracy that crowned the summit of her political structure. They had now been added in all their naive majesty and might to the forces that are fighting for freedom in the world, for justice and for peace. Here is a partner for a League of Honor. 53. The Russian Revolution, initiated in February/March 1917, was for Wilson the ray of hope in the sea of despair that had engulfed much of Europe. About the developments then unfolding, I have great sympathy with them. 54. In considering the composition of a U.S. delegation to the new Russia, Wilson required that they should be all genuinely enthusiastic for the success of the Russian Revolution. 55. It is difficult to say how determinant the history-making events in Russia were in Wilson's calculus for going to war with Germany. Colonel House is reported to have said that but for the Russian Revolution and famous German telegram to Mexico, President would have found it very difficult to take decisive step. 56. The disposal of the last absolute monarch in Europe, Nicholas II, certainly made it easier for him to sell it to the U.S. public. Point 57. Wall Street, the financier J.P. Morgan in particular, on the other hand, would have had no need for a democratic cover. Wilson's promise that Washington would facilitate the extension to governments of the most liberal financial credits was all that it needed to hear. Point 58. One can only imagine what Lenin thought of Wilson's declaration. Nothing, unfortunately, is available in the published record, probably because in that moment he was forced, mainly by the Entente governments, to take an unusually circuitous route back to Russia. Point 59. Wilson's declaration, to be noted, came a month after his second inauguration, made possible by an election campaign on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Not the last time a Democratic Party anti-war candidate would lead the nation to war. Once back in Russia on April 5, 18th, Lenin quickly picked up from where he had left off in 1914, using the newly conquered political space to propagate the Bolshevik program in the electoral/parliamentary arena in order, as Marx and Engels taught him, to count their forces to determine the best time to launch the armed struggle. Point 60. Not only were the local municipal councils, the Dumas, back in operation, but as well, and more importantly, the councils of workers, soldiers, and peasants, the Soviets. They appeared spontaneously with the overthrow of the Tsar, just as they had, momentarily, in the 1905 revolution, and why Lenin often referred to that upheaval as the dress rehearsal for 1917. He had a very able partner to assist him. Leon Trotsky, the leader of the fabled St. Petersburg Soviet of Workers and Soldiers in 1905, as well as bitter opponent of Lenin for more than a decade, returned from exile most recently in New York in early May. He immediately joined Lenin to lead the Bolsheviks eventually to power in October, arguably the most consequential political reconciliation in history. In print and public speeches, Lenin prioritized the pressing question how to end the war. "Beware of those," he advised in the Tasks of the Proletariat in Our Revolution, a pamphlet intended to arm the Bolsheviks politically, his so-called April theses, who promoted revolutionary defensism, the claim that the war now had a progressive character with the Tsar's deposition. The bourgeoisie deceives the people by working on their noble pride in the revolution and by pretending that the social and political character of the war, as far as Russia is concerned, underwent a change because of the stage of the revolution, because of the substitution of the near republic, for the Tsarist monarchy. Written on April 10/23, it was effectively Lenin's response to Wilson's April 2 speech to Congress, specifically, his newfound admiration for the Russian people, in all their naive majesty, that are fighting for freedom in the world, for justice and for peace. To make his point, Lenin continued most pedagogically. What is required of us is the ability to explain to the masses that the social and political character of the war is determined not by the goodwill of individuals or groups, or even of nations, but by the position of the class which conducts the war, by the class policy of which the war is a continuation, by the ties of capital, which is the dominant economic force in modern society, by the imperialist character of international capital, by Russia's dependence in finance, banking and diplomacy upon Britain, France, and so on. To explain this skillfully in a way the people would understand is not easy. None of us would be able to do it at once without committing errors. 61. It is doubtful that Lenin had read Wilson's speech. He would have referenced it, but his thesis on revolutionary defensism spoke directly to his siren call to the Russian people to maintain the course. And to be as transparent as possible, he concluded. It is impossible to slip out of the imperialist war and achieve a democratic, non-coercive peace without overthrowing the power of capital and transferring state power to another class, the proletariat. The Russian Revolution of February-March 1917 was the beginning of the transformation of the imperialist war into a civil war. This revolution took the first step towards ending the war, but it requires a second step, namely, the transfer of state power to the proletariat, to make the end of the war a certainty. This will be the beginning of a breakthrough on a worldwide scale, a breakthrough in the front of capitalist interests, and only by breaking through this front can the proletariat save mankind from the horrors of war and endow it with the blessings of peace. 62. Published in the Bolsheviks' daily, Soldatskaya Pravda, or Soldier's Truth, Washington had no excuse now for not knowing Lenin's agenda. The professor that Wilson placed his hopes in, Pavel Milyukov, who he had met as an academic in the U.S. some years earlier, an eminent Russian historian and leader of the Constitutional Democrats or Cadets, the leading liberal party in Russia, quickly, pardon the pun, became history. The government he had served in as Minister of Foreign Affairs was brought down in early May by mass protests owing to its insistence that Russia stay in the war to fulfill its treaty commitments to the other Entente powers. In the first of only 2 direct messages Wilson ever sent to the provisional government, on May 22, he urged that Russia, now a great democracy, continue the persecution of the war against the German autocracy, whatever the cost in life and treasure, to bring victory to the cause of democracy and human liberty. 63. And to back up its request, Washington provided major financial and material aid to the new government. To the very end, the provisional government assured Wilson that it would stay in the war to its peril. In calling on Russians to persecute the war, whatever the cost in life and treasure, Wilson's message could be evidence for war-weary Russians for Lenin's claim that he'd been making in print and in speeches, as in this concluding comment to a group of soldiers on April 10, 23. Our government, a government of the capitalists, is continuing the war in the interests of the capitalists. Like the German capitalists, headed by their crowned brigand Wilhelm, the capitalists of all the other countries are carrying on the war only for a division of capitalist profits, for domination over the world. Hundreds of millions of people, almost all the countries in the world, have been dragged into this criminal war. Hundreds of billions of capital have been invested in profitable undertakings, bringing death, hunger, ruin, and barbarism to the peoples and staggering, scandalously high profits to the capitalists. There is only one way to get out of this frightful war and conclude a truly democratic peace not imposed by force, and that is by transferring all the state power to the Soviets of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies. The workers and poor peasants, who are not interested in preserving the profits of the capitalists and robbing the weaker nations, will be able to do effectively what the capitalists only promise, namely, end the war by concluding a lasting peace that will assure liberty to all peoples without exception. 64. Maybe if Lenin's pamphlet and speeches had been available to Wilson, he might have been more aware of the actual sentiment of the naive Russian people. By 1917, if not before, they were less interested in bringing autocratic Germany to heel and exacting capital's pound of flesh than simply ending the bloodletting. Wilson would soon regret his myopia. He and the class interests he represented would pay a high price for the blinders they wore. 65. The war issue was also determinant in the course of the Russian Revolution because of the carnage, increasingly exhausting the Russian people and their patience. And inextricably linked to the war was the fundamental question of democratic representation, as Lenin constantly underscored, how best to ensure the desires and interests of the masses in the governing process. 66 Key in understanding the dynamic from February to November was the contestation between two radically different forms of representative democracy. On the one hand, Western European-style parliamentary democracy, what the provisional government represented or, at least potentially once it convened a constituent assembly, and on the other, a uniquely Russian invention, Soviet democracy. Washington's ambassador in Petrograd alerted his superiors on May 11 that the Soviets gave voice to the overwhelming sentiment in Russia to pull its troops out of the war, even, alarmingly in his opinion, using for justification Wilson's pledge in his January 22 address, Peace Without Victory. 67 No protagonist was as single-minded in promoting Soviet governance as Lenin. For the first time, on June 15 too, he called publicly, in Pravda, for all power to the Soviets of workers' and soldiers' deputies. No confidence in the government of the capitalists. The context makes clear that he did so for propaganda purposes and not for agitation or to incite, at least then. 68. The Bolshevik leader first appeared on Wilson's radar by mistake, but the reason is instructive. He had been erroneously identified as leading a march on the U.S. Embassy in Petrograd to protest the impending execution of the radical labor leader Tom Mooney in California. As noted earlier, some violent anti-preparedness demonstrations took place in the U.S. West the previous year. Mooney was convicted of having been responsible for one in San Francisco and was sentenced to death. Wilson asked the governor of California to commute the sentence because it would greatly relieve some critical situations outside the United States, which he did. 69 What the incident revealed is that Wilson was by now sensitive to the impact of the Russian Revolution elsewhere, especially in the U.S. He now had a name to help make the connection. By early August 1917, Wilson learned that he should have known that the opposition to the war on the part of the extremists in Russia had been so strong and met with such popular response. 70 The extremists were, of course, Lenin's Bolsheviks. In an effort to shore up the sagging morale of the provisional government, headed now by Alexander Kerensky of the peasant-based Socialist Revolutionary Party, Wilson sent a message of solidarity on August 24 to the Democratic Conference called by moderate and reformist forces looking for an alternative to revolution. He assured them that the people of the United States were confident in the ultimate triumph of ideals of democracy and self-government against all enemies within and without, and prepared to provide every material and moral assistance they can extend to the government of Russia in the promotion of the common cause, to defeat autocratic Germany. 71 His goal, again, to convince the provisional government to stay the course in the war. The Bolsheviks attended the conference but were critical of its deliberations. For Lenin it was a diversion, to sidetrack the real movement, the masses in the streets. Almost exactly 2 months later, October-November 25, 7, the Bolsheviks led Russia's war-weary workers, soldiers, and peasants to power by overthrowing the provisional government in order to have for the first time a government that represented their interests, especially on the war question. The prominent journalist and one-time Illuminati of the Socialist Party Charles Edward Russell tried to explain to Wilson the mood in Russia while, unbeknownst to him, the overthrow was underway on November 7. The problem for those who wanted Russia to stay the course was that the average Russian sees nothing in that war that appeals to the soul in him. The war was made by the Tsar, that mere fact prejudices the average Russian against it. The typical Russian only acknowledges the duty of a democrat to fight for democracy. The task was then to convince Russians through an education campaign, addressed to the Russian passion for democracy, and if it shows him that his beloved revolution is in peril, he will be ready to fight with all his strength, and there is no better fighter in the world. 72 I deeply appreciate your letter, responded Wilson on November 10, when he would have known by then about the overthrow. It runs along the lines of my own thought, only you speak from knowledge and I have thought by inference. He said that he'd do his best to act along the lines Russell suggested, but admitted that it would be extremely difficult because no one channel connects with any other, apparently. Washington, in other words, now lacked the kinds of connections it once had to the provisional government. Thus, Wilson, at least in that moment, the first few days of the Bolshevik October/November Revolution, implicitly acknowledged that the extremists came to power on a popular wave of mass opposition to the provisional government owing to its failure to extricate Russia from the bloodletting that the war had become. 73 In real time, in other words, Wilson viewed the Bolshevik Revolution as a popularly supported overturn in stark contrast to the Cold War portrait painted by subsequent U.S. presidents. The popularity of the revolt was registered in the fact that in Petrograd, the main scene of the action, only a total of 5 people had been killed and several more wounded, most from stray bullets. 74 That must have impressed Wilson, who had had an aversion to revolutions owing to their usually bloody character. The challenge he now faced with the Bolsheviks in power was how to convince Russia to stay in the war in the name of making the world safe for democracy, and to show the Russian people that Washington was not a threat to their beloved revolution when the Bolsheviks refused to go along with his agenda. Those increasingly incompatible goals engendered increasingly contradictory actions on his part. Wilson, as events would show, was at a disadvantage. Lenin knew more about him than Wilson did about his new adversary. The Bolsheviks in power. Peace, land, and bread, had been the Bolsheviks' months-long campaign slogan for taking power. Enabling their success had been their almost decade-long usage of the electoral/parliamentary process, the Soviets, and the Dumas, to determine when best to carry out an armed struggle. 75 Most significant about that work is that it was also, as already noted, carried out in the Soviets amongst the armed forces. Soldiers and sailors were for Lenin peasants in uniform, crucial in the realization of the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry, the imposition or domination of majority rule. 76 Lenin, to be remembered, had long argued that only if the working class masses were in power could imperialist wars be prevented. By September 1917 the tactic of using the electoral/parliamentary venue for revolutionary action began to pay off when the Bolsheviks emerged as the leading party in the elections to the Soviets, campaigning, again, on the peace, land, and bread slogan. That's when Lenin was able to convince the rest of Bolshevik leadership that the time for an armed taking of power via the authority of the Soviets had arrived. Trotsky's assistance was invaluable, without which it's unlikely Lenin would have prevailed. With Lenin as head of the new Soviet government and Trotsky as its Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Wilson administration now had a formidable adversary. The very first decrees of the new Soviet government, drafted by Lenin and ratified by the Second Congress of the Soviets of Workers and Soldiers Deputies on October 25 to November 26, 7-8, were about, not unexpectedly, the war and land issues. The first called on the belligerent powers to immediately end hostilities and to commit to a peace without annexations. When Wilson learned what happened to the Constituent Assembly, he expressed dismay and bemoaned to House, "Here is the ever-recurring question. How to deal with the Bolsheviki?" One of the epigrams that opened this chapter. 92 But there is no record of a public rebuke of the Bolsheviks. In fact, 2 months later, March 11, he sent a letter of encouragement to the Congress of Soviets that was to debate the Bolshevik proposal to accept the onerous conditions Berlin had imposed at Brest-Litovsk. The delay in the German working class doing what their cohorts in Russia had done, to make a revolution, forced the taking of that bitter pill. "May I not," Wilson began, "take advantage of the meeting of the Congress of the Soviet to express the sincere sympathy which the people of the United States feel for the Russian people at this moment when the German power has been thrust in to interrupt and turn back the whole struggle for freedom and substitute the wishes of Germany for the purposes of the people of Russia. Although the government of the United States is unhappily not now in a position to render the direct and effective aid it would wish to render, I beg to assure the people of Russia through their Congress that it will avail itself of every opportunity that may offer to secure for Russia once more complete sovereignty and independence in her own affairs and full restoration to her great role in the life of Europe and the modern world. The whole heart of the people of the United States is with the people of Russia in the attempt to free themselves forever from autocratic government and become the masters of their own life. 93. Unlike his 14-point speech, Wilson's message was directed to the Russian people. This time there was no mention of their present leaders. But as long as he thought their beloved revolution was still a fact, he couldn't risk alienating them with any hint of an overt attack on Lenin and Trotsky. Also noteworthy is that he implicitly accepted, despite the proroguing of the Constituent Assembly, the mode of governance of their beloved revolution, that is, their Congress of Soviets. Wilson's message required Lenin to be at his diplomatic best in responding to the apparently friendly gesture. Following Wilson's lead, he addressed his message of March 14 endorsed by the delegates to the gathering to the American people. The Congress expresses its gratitude to the American people, and primarily to the working and exploited classes of the United States of America, in connection with President Wilson's expression of his sympathy for the Russian people through the Congress of Soviets at a time when the Soviet Socialist Republic of Russia is passing through severe trials. The Russian Soviet Republic, having become a neutral country, takes advantage of the message received from President Wilson to express to all peoples that are perishing and suffering from the horrors of the imperialist war its profound sympathy and firm conviction that the happy time is not far away when the working people of all bourgeois countries will throw off the yoke of capital and establish the socialist system of society, the only system able to ensure a durable and just peace and also culture and well-being for all working people. 94. If Wilson could take advantage of the moment, so too could Lenin to encourage not only the toilers in the US but elsewhere to consider civil war against their own exploiters. He gave, in doing so, new meaning to what the Bolsheviks meant by open diplomacy. Exposing secret treaties and having public diplomatic negotiations was for driving a wedge between the toilers and their rulers. Wilson wasn't clueless. Russian trust of America was held by a very slender thread, he told the British ambassador a few days later. Trotsky and Lenin evidently had a notion that the American administration existed for the benefit of the capitalists. 95. The Bolsheviks continued to needle Wilson's liberal self-image. Lenin's March 14 message to the American people was the first of three, signaling the pas de deux he now engaged in with Wilson. From the counter-revolution to Versailles. Wilson increasingly came under pressure from Prime Minister Lloyd George of Britain and President Georges Clemenceau of France to give military support to the counter-revolutionary forces in Russia that were grouping to overthrow Bolshevik rule. He eventually relented to the entreaties, but in his own unique way. He could only justify to himself the decision on July 6, 1918, to send U.S. troops to Russia on the grounds he was providing humanitarian aid to prevent a German takeover of the embattled country. "I have been sweating blood," he wrote on July 8, "over the question what is right and feasible to do in Russia. I hope I see and can report some progress presently doing the double line of economic assistance and aid to the Czechoslovaks." 96. On August 7, I have felt no confidence in my personal judgment about the complicated situation in Russia. 97. The Czechoslovaks issue referred to about 70,000 combatants from the Austro-Hungarian Empire recruited by the provisional government to fight against the Central Powers. After the Bolshevik ascent and Brest-Litovsk they were no longer needed and, thus, essentially stranded in Russia. Whereas the British saw them as potential fodder for both the counter-revolution and continuing war against Germany, interrelated goals in their view, Wilson's stated priority was to evacuate them out of Russia. Sending U.S. troops to do so, he insisted, was neither to interfere with internal affairs in Russia 98 nor to be a military intervention. The latter, as explained in the aid memoir to General William Graves who headed up the Siberian intervention, would only add to the present sad confusion in Russia rather than cure it, injure her rather than help her, and that it would be of no advantage whatever in the prosecution of our main design, to win the war against Germany. 99. Graves, to be seen, faithfully obeyed what was on paper with all the consequences. As for the offer of economic assistance to the new Soviet government, Wilson assumed that it would be seen as a display of goodwill on his part. Lenin, however, refused to be seduced. 6 weeks later he denounced the predatory expedition against on the plea that they want to protect Russia from the Germans. They were the governments of America, France, and Britain that were beholden to the handful of multimillionaires. The American multimillionaires were, perhaps, richest of all, who had reaped untold profits from the ocean of blood that had been shed by the 10 million killed and 20 million maimed in the great, noble, liberating and holy war 100. Yet Lenin's famous 5,000-word letter to American workers of August 20, 1918, was a measured response to Wilson's decision to send U.S. troops to Russia for the first time. It seemed to have sensed Wilson's all too familiar liberal hand-wringing and replied accordingly. 101 Lenin, however, couldn't resist at least one poke to Wilson's liberal underbelly. It had to do with the jailing of socialist leader Eugene V. Debs for his anti-US intervention stance into the war. I am not surprised that Wilson, the only direct reference to him, the head of the American multimillionaires and servant of the capitalist sharks, has thrown Debs into prison. More importantly, Lenin's letter was a direct appeal to the U.S. proletariat in response, apparently, to a letter of solidarity with the Bolsheviks from workers in Seattle. 102 Pedagogically written to explain the raison d'etre of the Russian Revolution in order to counter the lies and slanders about it in the American bourgeois newspapers. He drew parallels between U.S. revolutionary history, especially, the Civil War, and developments underway in Russia. He reminded readers why the revolution had to make painful decisions, such as the onerous concessions to Germany at Brest-Litovsk, and to take harsh measures, such as the Red Terror against opponents. It is this imperialist war that is the cause of all these misfortunes. The revolution engendered by the war cannot avoid the terrible difficulties and suffering bequeathed it by the prolonged, ruinous, reactionary slaughter of the nations. To blame us for the destruction of industry, or for the terror, is either hypocrisy or dull-wit pedantry. It reveals an inability to understand the basic conditions of the fierce class struggle, raised to the highest degree of intensity that is called revolution. 103. Lenin readily admitted to the 100 mistakes we commit, such as the overnight abolition of private ownership of land or the nationalization of almost all the biggest factories and plants with a workforce lacking the skills to manage them. We know, toward the end, that circumstances brought our Russian detachment of the socialist proletariat to the fore not because of our merits, but because of the exceptional backwardness of Russia, and that before the world revolution breaks out a number of separate revolutions may be defeated. 104 Events within a few months would justify Lenin's sobriety. His letter, published in Pravda, was, with some difficulty, given the Allied/Central Powers blockade of Russia, republished in numerous socialist venues in the U.S. Though there's no mention of it in the papers of Woodrow Wilson, it's unlikely he didn't read or know about Lenin's most conscious intervention yet into U.S. politics. The Red Terror, in response to the assassination on July 5 of the German ambassador to Russia by left socialist revolutionaries, their attempt to restart the war with Germany because of the harsh conditions of Brest-Litovsk and near assassination of Lenin shortly afterward, and his defense of the bloody crackdown were no doubt deeply unsettling to Wilson. Because Lenin reminded his readers about the time when terror was just and legitimate, the terror, of the French bourgeoisie, in 1793, the letter may have triggered Wilson's anti-French Revolution sensibilities. To an interviewer a few months later, he said, "The present state of Russia is very much the same as that of France during the Revolution. The acts of violence which are taking place in Russia now are as much to be deplored as were those which took place in France then." 105 And for Lenin to call for the other detachments of the world socialist revolution to come to our relief was probably the beginning of Wilson's rethinking his so far hands-off stance toward the Bolsheviks. The suggestion that Lenin's letter was a measured response to Wilson's decision to send U.S. troops to Siberia is reinforced by a report a few weeks later of the new Commissar of Foreign Affairs, Georgy Chicherin. Although the government of the United States has been obliged to consent to intervention, he told the Executive Committee of the Soviet government on September 2, this consent is merely formal. The committee agreed with Chicherin's policy. 106. A month later Chicherin sent a 3,600-word note to Wilson for which Lenin provided the outline and tone. It began by reminding Wilson about point 6 in his 14-point speech, his pledge to respect Russia's self-determination, and message of solidarity in March to the Congress of Soviets. Landing U.S. troops not only in Siberia but in northern Russia, under British command, and support to the stranded Czechoslovak troops contradicted, Chicherin argued, Wilson's stated claims of neutrality about Russia's course. Despite Washington's actions, he continued, "We are ready, Mr. President, to conclude an armistice on these conditions, and we ask you to notify us when you, Mr. President, and your allies intend to remove your troops from Murmansk, Archangel, and Siberia 107. Then the note went on the offensive, to make the case for the legitimacy of the October/November Revolution. Soviet governance, it argued, represented at least 80% of the Russian people. This cannot, Mr. President, be said about your government. That probably stuck in Wilson's craw. He knew that unlike in Russia, women in America had yet to gain the right to vote. He also knew that America's darker-hued denizens were in an even more precarious position given his own administration's policies toward them. If red terror was to his liberal distaste, white terror in the face of the Ku Klux Klan was somehow digestible for the son of the Confederacy. For the Bolsheviks to hint at such hypocrisy must also have been galling. To add insult to injury, Chicherin advised Wilson how to construct a League of Nations which you propose as the crowning work of peace. You know as well as we, Mr. President, that this war is the outcome of the policies of all capitalistic nations. We propose, therefore, Mr. President, that the League of Nations be based on the expropriation of the capitalists of all countries. The message dripped with sarcasm. About Wilson's demand for independence for various peoples in Europe, strangely enough we do not find among your demands the liberation of Ireland, Egypt, or India, nor even the liberation of the Philippines, and we would be very sorry if these peoples should be denied the opportunity to participate together with us, through their freely elected representatives, in the organization of the League of Nations. If the Bolsheviks pioneered open diplomacy with their exposure of the secret treaties and public negotiations with Berlin, Chicherin's note initiated what might be called cheeky diplomacy. Lenin advised Chicherin about how to compose it, write it in detail, politely, but caustically, saying, "In any case we consider it our duty to propose peace even to governments of capitalists and multimillionaires in order to try to stop the bloodshed and to open the eyes of the people. Do the capitalists want some of the forests in the north, part of Siberia, interest on 17,000 millions? Regarding the Brest peace, Germany will agree to withdraw her troops. What's the matter then? Do you want to replace the German troops with your own troops?" And so on. 108. Not surprisingly, Wilson chose to ignore the note as his Secretary of State Lansing advised. Having long wanted to do away with the Bolsheviks since their ascent in October/November 1917, he urged his boss to see the message as a definite turning point in our relations with the Bolsheviki. 109. But most objectionable about the Bolsheviks for Lansing wasn't their insolence or even the Red Terror. Rather, it was their giving special recognition to a particular class of society as if it possessed exceptional rights. 110. That is, as he put it a year earlier, the despotism of a class, what the Bolsheviks called the dictatorship of the proletariat. On November 2, William Bullitt, the State Department's point man on Russia, submitted an informative report to Lansing, the Bolshevist movement in Europe, indicating increase of Bolshevism and methods of combating Bolshevism. 111. 3 days later at a cabinet meeting the president spoke of the Bolsheviki having decided upon a revolution in Germany, Hungary, and Switzerland, and that they had $10 million ready in Switzerland, besides more money in Swedish banks held by the Jews from Russia, ready for the campaign of propaganda. 112. Wilson must have felt vindicated about his warning when he received the next day the following cable: "Outbreak of revolution in Germany begun by sailors on the dreadnought Kaiser. Later spread to rest of the fleet in harbor, finally spreading through the entire province of Schleswig. The sailors mounted the red flag and took possession of the town after seizing ships." 113. In Lenin's view, the peace decrees of the new Soviet government in October/November 1917, the publication of the secret treaties of the Entente powers, the onerous concessions made at Brest-Litovsk had finally paid off. The German soldiers have been infected by Bolshevism. 114. Though the uprising in Germany put an end to the carnage of World War I, what the armistice of November 11 agreed to, as well as Germany's last monarch, Wilson, and his allies greeted it with dread. It threatened to be a replay of what the Bolsheviks had done a year earlier. Revolutionary Germany, more than anything, convinced Wilson to see the Bolsheviks now as a poison, the term he most often employed in referring to them from then on. It's as if he was reading Lenin. On board the George Washington on his way to Paris for the negotiations to end the Great War, Wilson gave a press conference on December 9 about his agenda for the deliberations. Bullitt's diary entry is revealing. The president did not mention Russia directly but said, "The only way I can explain susceptibility of the people of Europe to the poison of Bolshevism, is that the governments have been run for wrong purposes, and I am convinced that if this peace is not made on the highest principles of justice, it will be swept away by the peoples of the world in less than a generation." 115. Wilson didn't live long enough to learn how prophetic his warning had been. Lenin accurately recognized Wilson's new anti-Bolshevik posture. 4 days earlier he advised a workers' meeting in Moscow to beware of Wilson's agents, crushing the revolution in Austria, playing the gendarme, issuing an ultimatum to Switzerland: "You'll get no bread from us if you don't join the fight against the Bolshevik government. Theirs is a simple weapon, the noose of famine. That is what they are using to strangle the peoples." 116. Bread referred to Wilson's answer to the Bolsheviks, as he put it so plainly a month later on January 10, 1919, to Lansing and his secretary Joseph Tumulty: "The real thing with which to stop Bolshevism is food. Bolshevism is steadily advancing westward, has overwhelmed Poland, and is poisoning Germany. It cannot be stopped by force, but it can be stopped by food. To our real friends in Poland, and to the people of the liberated units of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and to our associates in the Balkans." 117. A future U.S. president would manage for Wilson this new modern weapon, Herbert Hoover. "Our job now," Lenin told the Moscow gathering, "is to wage a desperate struggle against British and American imperialism. Just because it feels that Bolshevism has become a world force, it is trying to throttle us as fast as possible in the hope of dealing with the Russian Bolsheviks, and then, with its own." 118. Lenin's reference to its own anticipated Wilson's domestic version of the Red Terror, the anti-Bolshevik campaign his administration launched in the summer of 1919, known as the Red Scare. The successes of the Red Terror in combination with the German Revolution meant, Lenin argued, that the Bolsheviks were now in a stronger position than when they made the harsh concessions at Brest-Litovsk. "No wonder," Wilson declared, "our enemy now is world Bolshevism. That is what the bourgeoisie all over the world are saying. The fact that they are preparing to attack us means they realize that the Bolshevik government is not only a Russian but a world phenomenon." 119. Wilson, indeed, by the end of 1918 was almost obsessed with checking the advance of Bolshevism to the westward and the need for an allied general policy as to how to meet the social danger of Bolshevism. 120. And to that end he needed intelligence. "I am keenly interested in finding the interior of their minds." 121. While Wilson's allied partners may have wanted to attack the Bolsheviks, he called rather for negotiations, as he argued at the Paris deliberations on January 21, 1919. One of the things that was clear in the Russian situation was that by opposing Bolshevism with arms they were in reality serving the cause of Bolshevism. The Allies were making it possible for Bolsheviks to argue that imperialistic and capitalistic governments were endeavoring to exploit the country and to give the land back to the landlords, and so bring about a reaction. If it could be shown that this was not true and that the Allies were prepared to deal with the rulers of Russia, much of the moral force of this argument would disappear. The allegation that the Allies were against the people and wanted to control their affairs provided the argument which enabled them to raise armies. If, on the other hand, the Allies could swallow their pride and the natural repulsion which they felt for the Bolsheviks, and see the representatives of all organized groups in one place, he thought it would bring about a marked reaction against Bolshevism. 122. As Lenin and Trotsky had recognized for more than a year, Wilson's image of himself and his nation morally superior to old Europe with its imperialist history could be to their advantage. His advice to negotiate with the Bolsheviks rather than attack them was consistent with his aide memoir to General Graves, who headed up the U.S. intervention in Siberia. It was not to be a military intervention. Hence, why the Bolsheviks were willing to engage in a diplomatic dance with Wilson. Lenin for sure. 123 About a month earlier, on December 23, they sent a peace offer to the Allies. No doubt that Lenin had a hand in composing. 124 While he had to be on guard for the worst, they are preparing to attack us, he couldn't afford to be an inevitabilist. Though rejected, the offer forced Wilson to come up with an alternative, a conference of all the Russian belligerents to be held on the Turkish island of Principe near Constantinople. Wilson's recommendation that his allies swallow their pride was a plea that they invite the Bolsheviks to partake in the talks. Because the counter-revolutionary White Army leaders refused to attend at the urgings of the French, it never happened. That didn't deter the Bolsheviks from taking other diplomatic initiatives that they thought might be attractive to Wilson, since he held most of the cards in the Allied coalition. Wilson's liberal contradictions about Russia were on full display in his closed-door remarks to members of the Democratic Party National Committee on February 28, 1919, following a couple of sobering months of negotiations with his Allied partners. In words that resonate all so well a century later, the present danger in this world is that peoples of world do not believe in their own governments. They believe these governments to be made up of the kind of men who have always run them, and who did not know how to keep them out of this war, did not know how to prepare them for war, and did not know how to settle international controversies in the past without making all sorts of compromising concessions. While we in the U.S., he continued, are not ideal people, we are infinitely better than the others. With, again, such a low opinion of old Europe, Wilson could then say what he did about the Russian question. The only thing that ugly, poisonous thing called Bolshevism feeds on is the doubt of the man on the street of the essential integrity of the people he is depending on to do his governing. That is what it feeds on. No man in his senses would think that a lot of local Soviets could really run a government, but some of them are in a temper to have anything rather than the kind of thing they have been having, and they say to themselves, well, this may be bad, but it is at least better and more immediately in touch with us than the other, and we will try it and see whether we cannot work something out of it. It is not our business to dictate what kind of government Russia shall have. The only thing to do is to see if we can help them by conference and suggestion and recognition of the right elements to get together and not leave the country in a state of chaos. 125. In other words, the Bolshevik appeal, despite they being the most consummate sneaks in the world, was understandable. Wilson took serious enough the new mode of Soviet governance in order to dismiss it. He was still peeved about Trotsky's dig about his morally superior homeland, that the United States is in the hands of capitalists and does not serve anybody else's interests but the capitalists. And the worst of it, I think he honestly believes it. For this son of a pre-capitalist world, the Confederacy, Trotsky's charge was incredulous. Not surprising again, Lenin was willing to engage Wilson in all his contradictions, liberal and pre-liberal. A Cold War reading of the Soviet Union may see Wilson's opinion of Lenin's Russia as, at best, naive, or worst, unpardonable. But that's hindsight about the Bolshevik Revolution. Wilson's assessment of developments in Russia is almost a class mirror image of that of Lenin, from the other side of the barricades. Just a few days later, Lenin told the opening session of the First Congress of the Communist International his answer to Wilson's League of Nations: the bourgeoisie are terror-stricken at the growing workers' revolutionary movement. This is understandable if we take into account that the development of events since the imperialist war inevitably favors the workers' revolutionary movement, and that the world revolution is beginning and growing in intensity everywhere. 126 A month later, to the Moscow Soviet, he opined, the imperialists of Britain, France, and America are making their last attempt to bring us to our knees, but they will fail. 127 He was heartened by reports about the squabbling amongst the Allied powers at Paris. The Committee of Ten has now been reduced, and there are now only 4: Wilson, Lloyd, Clemenceau, and Orlando. These are the leaders of the 4 nations, but even they cannot reach an agreement. Our enemies cannot agree among themselves. 5 months have passed since they won their victory, but they have not concluded peace. 128 and a week later to another Moscow gathering, we might say that Messrs. Wilson and Clemenceau have set out to help us. The cables which every day bring us news about their quarrels, about their desire to slam the door in each other's faces, show that these gentlemen are at each other's throats. 129 It's as if Lenin knew why Wilson's candid report to Democratic Party National Committee members on the Paris negotiations had to be, as Wilson put it, in the confidence of this Company 130. As for what Lenin thought of Wilson's poison charge about the Bolsheviks, the imperialists of the Entente countries are blockading Russia in an effort to cut off the Soviet Republic, as a seat of infection, from the capitalist world. Just think of it, the advanced, most civilized and democratic countries, armed to the teeth and enjoying undivided military sway over the whole world, are mortally afraid of the ideological infection coming from a ruined, starving, backward, and even, they assert, semi-savage country. 131 At that very moment the Senate Judiciary Committee was conducting hearings in Washington on Bolshevik propaganda activities in the United States. Washington had reason to be concerned. A week-long general strike in Seattle in February 1919, the first of its kind in the U.S., had been inspired in part by Soviet power and Lenin's writings. 132 His letter to American workers, to be remembered, was a response to a workers' solidarity message from Seattle. Regarding Wilson's anti-interventionist declarations, Lenin told another Moscow gathering a few weeks later, "No matter how much the Lloyd Georges, Wilsons, and Clemenceaus may assure us that they have abandoned the idea of intervention, we know they are lying." 133 Events in Seattle and elsewhere in the world convinced Lenin that his enemies had every reason to fear the Bolsheviks. Lenin's remark in his letter to American workers that before the world revolution breaks out a number of separate revolutions may be defeated was instantiated when the 2 most Bolshevik-like leaders in the German Revolution were assassinated in January 1919, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. Though Lenin recognized that the brutal and treacherous murder is the most dramatic and tragic event in the revolution beginning in Germany, 134 Only in retrospect would the costly consequences of their loss become clear: the failure of Germany's working class to duplicate what their Russian cohorts had done. If Lenin understood the significance of the assassinations of Luxemburg and Liebknecht, Wilson didn't. As far as he could see, the German Revolution was alive and well and just as foreboding. His reaction to the news Travers Grayson, his doctor and close confidant, gave him on March 10, 1919, on board the USS George Washington on his way back to the Paris negotiations is also telling. According to Grayson's diary entry, the article reported that the settlement of a general strike in Berlin included recognition by the government of soldiers and workers' councils. After reading this article, the president said that this looked bad, that if the present government of Germany is recognizing the soldiers and workers' councils, it is delivering itself into the hands of the Bolshevists. He said the American Negro returning from abroad would be our greatest medium in conveying Bolshevism to America. For example, a friend recently related the experience of a lady friend wanting to employ a Negro laundress offering to pay the usual wage in that community. The negress demands that she be given more money than was offered for the reason that money is as much mine as it is yours. Furthermore, he called attention to the fact that the French people have placed the Negro soldier in France on an equality with the white man, and it has gone to their heads. 135. For this son of the Confederacy for whom radical Reconstruction had been a nightmare, the specter of black Americans being a spearhead for Bolshevism in the U.S. must have been deeply troubling. Lenin had, again, every reason to prepare for the worst from Wilson. Yet, Wilson's liberal hand-wringing may have proved in the end to be determinant. As much as he disliked the Bolsheviks, he could never bring himself to do what would have been necessary to overthrow them: a full-scale U.S. military intervention. His declarations about support for Russia's national self-determination. Point 6 in his 14-point speech wrapped him in a bundle of contradictions. Grayson's diary entry continued in capturing that fact. Discussing Bolshevism, the president referred to the fact that its theory had some advantages, but the trouble was that an attempt was being made to accomplish it in the wrong way. Lenin seemed to have sensed Wilson's liberal ambivalence about the Bolshevik project and, thus, treated him accordingly. Point 136. Lenin pursued two other initiatives to end the war with the Allied powers, the Bullet and Nansen missions. Responding to overtures from Moscow, Wilson sent Bullet in March to hold secret negotiations with Lenin and Chicherin to explore the possibilities of ending the Allied war against their government and for diplomatic recognition. Lenin pledged to make major concessions to end the aggression, but once the anti-Bolshevik press in Britain and the US learned about what was agreed to, Wilson disowned the proposals Bullet had carefully crafted with a wall of silence. Disillusioned, Bullet parted ways with Wilson. Point 137. His 13-page March 25, 1919, report on the mission only became public when he testified before a Senate committee later in September. Point 138. A month later, the well-known Norwegian explorer Fridtjof Nansen proposed a solution to the food crisis the Russian people were facing owing to the Allied blockade. Made in agreement with future U.S. President Herbert Hoover, who headed up food relief programs for the Allied powers, the proposal came with conditions designed to undermine Bolshevik hegemony. Though a non-starter for him, Lenin advised Chicherin and Litvinov to respond diplomatically and politically to the offer. My advice is, use it for propaganda, for clearly it can serve no other useful purpose. Be extremely polite to Nansen, extremely insolent to Wilson, Lloyd George, and Clemenceau. This is very useful, the only way to speak to them, the right tone. After reading Chicherin and Litvinov's draft response, Lenin made suggestions. The failed Bullet mission a month earlier was certainly on his mind in recommending that a clear distinction be made in the reply between Nansen's humanitarian aims and Hoover's all too apparent Allied politics in the proposal. As for the former, all thanks and compliments to Nansen personally. As for politics, that is, for peace, tell them you are perfectly aware that we are for it. We agreed to the Princess Islands. We confirmed this to Bullet, who, unfortunately, proved, like the whole of American policy, to be a captive of Clemenceau and Lloyd George, for what Bullet promised us, assuring us that America would make Clemenceau and Lloyd George come to heel, remained unfulfilled, not unforeseen. A quarter century before its commencement, Engels, again, anticipated such a war. But it wasn't inevitable. A revolution in Russia would save Europe from the horrors of a general war and would usher in universal social revolution. 3 years later he opined that owing to the increasing lethality of modern arms 15 to 20 million armed men would slaughter one another, a remarkably accurate and tragic forecast. And even more prescient, the resulting devastation would either lead to the immediate or later triumph of socialism. Engels's later prediction, as history would reveal, was more accurate. Rather than a Russian Revolution saving Europe from a general war, it was the Great War that brought into being the world's first socialist revolution, beginning with the February/March overthrow of the Romanov dynasty. The failure of the provisional government to extricate Russia from the carnage owing to Entente/Allied power pressure to stay in the war is what made Bolshevik ascendancy possible. But perhaps Engels was right in his earlier forecast, at least partially. Once in power, the Bolsheviks acted on their promise to do what the provisional government had not, to end Russia's involvement in the war. First, the immediate peace decrees in October/November, and, then, a proposal for talks with Berlin at Brest-Litovsk, initiatives that Wilson labeled naive and misguided. But the Bolsheviks challenged Wilson and the Allied powers to join them in the peace talks. Not wishing to appear less interested in ending the slaughter than the Bolsheviks, it provoked Wilson to issue his 14 points proposals. With Russia no longer a threat to Germany owing to the onerous concessions made at Brest-Litovsk, and the continuing campaign of the Bolsheviks to fraternize with German soldiers, it became increasingly difficult for the German regime to convince its workers in uniform that they had a class interest in defending the fatherland. Thus the revolution in the first week in November 1918, the deposition of the Kaiser, and the armistice. 8 months later the belligerents signed the Treaty of Versailles. The Bolsheviks, in other words, were responsible for setting into motion the process to end the slaughter that may have carried on much longer. If socialist revolution was unable to prevent the Great War, it played a key if not decisive role in its termination. 147. Nothing was inevitable about Bolshevik ascent and survival. Historical contingency is a better explanation. As Lenin put it in his letter to the American proletariat, we know that circumstances brought our Russian detachment of the socialist proletariat to the fore not because of our merits. He clearly had an agenda and was single-minded in its realization: lead the toilers to state power in order to end the carnage. Wilson was less informed and less focused, explaining perhaps the unintended consequences of his actions. In enticing and pressuring the provisional government that issued from the February/March revolution to stay the course, he unwittingly aided and abetted Lenin's project. He misread, unlike Lenin, the depths of the anti-war sentiment amongst Russia's masses. Never have unintended consequences been so consequential in modern history. Wilson came close to admitting his mistake, a rare and maybe singular admission in his career. The survival of the Bolshevik project precariously hung in the balance for almost 3 years after the October/November 1917 triumph. The real-time record reveals that the Bolsheviks, especially Lenin, astutely took advantage of Wilson's liberal contradictions to avoid its Red Army having to engage in combat with U.S. troops or, to keep it to a minimum as in the northern Archangel-Murmansk Operation 148, the only effective force that could have spelled their demise. Wilson's conundrum began with what posterity knows as his Peace Without Victory speech to Congress in January 1917, in which he declared that every people should be left to determine its own polity. A year later and 2 months after Bolshevik ascendancy, he was most specific in point 6 in his more famous 14-point speech. Russia, he stated, should know that it would have an unhampered and unembarrassed opportunity for the independent determination of her own political development and national policy, under institutions of her own choosing. That the Bolsheviks did all they could to advertise, with Wilson's blessing, the speech for which he was most proud and remembered was to be expected. If ever the useful idiot metaphor had currency often but erroneously attributed to Lenin, those 3 years might have been the most appropriate moment. But Wilson's seal of approval wasn't a gratuity. The Bolsheviks earned it due to their principled conduct from October/November, beginning with the world's first WikiLeaks dump, the secret treaties, and then to the Brest-Litovsk talks. The numerous peace proposals they proposed or agreed to were also designed to keep Wilson from being an implacable foe. Lenin, thus, engaged in a high-wire act with Wilson and without a safety net. And not the least of the liberal contradictions that entangled Wilson was his awareness that Bolshevik rule was popular, the most popular of all the warring parties in the Civil War. Lenin unlikely knew of Engels's forecast about the interconnectivity between social revolution in Russia and a generalized conflagration in Europe. Otherwise, he, arguably Marx and Engels's most faithful and capable student, would have cited it in Imperialism, his key text to explain the guns of August. In the 1920 introduction to the 1916 book, he offered some hindsight. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, dictated by monarchist Germany, and the subsequent much more brutal and despicable Treaty of Versailles, dictated by the Democratic Republics of America and France and also by Free Britain, have rendered a most useful service to humanity by exposing both imperialism's hired coolies of the pen and petty bourgeois reactionaries who, although they call themselves pacifists and socialists, sang praises to Wilsonism, and insisted that peace and reforms were possible. Under imperialism, the tens of millions of dead and maimed left by the war, a war to decide whether the British or German group of financial plunderers is to receive the most booty, and those 2 peace treaties, are with unprecedented rapidity opening the eyes of the millions and tens of millions of people who are downtrodden, oppressed, deceived and duped by the bourgeoisie. Thus, out of the universal ruin caused by the war, a worldwide revolutionary crisis is arising which, however prolonged and arduous its stages may be, cannot end otherwise than in a proletarian revolution, and in its victory. 149 The claim of universal ruin caused by the war and its consequences for proletarian revolution uncannily echoed and confirmed what Engels uttered a quarter of a century earlier. Unlike Wilson, Lenin, 14 years his junior, had benefited from a Head Start program that the more academically credentialed Wilson had no inkling of its existence. For Wilson's generation in the American Academy, the writings and practice Lenin's priority of Marx and Engels were simply unavailable. And that Lenin, without a foot in the formal academy, could offer what was probably the first critical take on what would later be called Wilsonianism is even more noteworthy. Lenin's critique of the Treaty of Versailles anticipated the far more informed assessment of the economist John Maynard Keynes, who participated in the talks on the side of the British. Keynes's stinging rebuke of the treaty, the economic consequences of the peace, was invaluable ammunition for Lenin. To the delegates at the Second Congress of the Communist International in July 1920, he declared, "I do not think any communist manifesto, or one that is revolutionary in general, could compare in forcefulness with those pages in Keynes's book which depict Wilson and Wilsonism in action. The masses of the workers now see more clearly than ever, from their own experience, that the roots of Wilson's policy lay in sanctimonious piffle, petit bourgeois phrase-mongering, and an utter inability to understand the class struggle. 150 Both he and Trotsky heartily recommended that communists, as they now called themselves, read Keynes's book. 4 months before his last and ultimately fatal stroke, Lenin was wrapping up his balance sheet on the October/November Revolution, now in its 5th year, for delegates to the 4th Congress of the Communist International, December 1922. Undoubtedly, we have done, and will still do, a host of foolish things. No one can judge and see this better than I, but I must also say a word or two in this respect about our enemies. Their foolish things, he continued, are worst. Take, for example, the agreement concluded by the U.S.A., Great Britain, France and Japan with Kalkak. I ask you, are there any more enlightened and more powerful countries in the world? But what happened? They promised to help Kalkak without calculation, without reflection, and without circumspection. It ended in a fiasco, which, it seems to me, is difficult for the human intellect to grasp. But more consequential of their foolish things was the Treaty of Versailles. I ask you, what have the great powers which have covered themselves with glory done? How will they find a way out of this chaos and confusion? 151 It is hard to imagine Wilson going before a public audience, especially an international one, to offer any kind of remorse about his actions. As for Lenin not seeing the foolish things that might explain the Stalinist outcome of the revolution, that, I argue, is hindsight and not real-time analysis, a point I'll revisit in the concluding chapter. Unlike Lenin, unable to speak and completely paralyzed from March 10, 1923, to his death on January 21, 1924, Wilson continued to be active. His last substantive publication, a 1,000-word essay in the August 1923 issue of Atlantic Monthly magazine, reveals that he was still, since January 1918, grappling with the ever-recurring question: how shall we deal with the Bolsheviki? They were still on his brain 5 years later due to these doubtful and anxious days, when all the world is at unrest. The Road Away from Revolution, the title of the essay, sought an explanation for and an alternative to the Russian Revolution, the outstanding event of its kind in our age. The overturn was the product of a whole social system. It was against capitalism that the Russian leaders directed their attack, and it is against capitalism under one name or another that the discontented classes everywhere draw their indictment. And might not there be just cause for those grievances? Is it not, too, true that capitalists have often seemed to regard the men whom they used as mere instruments of profit, whose physical and mental powers it was legitimate to exploit with as slight cost to themselves as possible, either of money or of sympathy? Wilson affirmed that it was. These offenses against high morality and true citizenship have been frequently observable. With great irony, Wilson and Lenin agreed, apparently, at the end of the lives about the cause for generalized discontent capitalism. No wonder, again, Lenin had seen the need to take advantage of his contradictions. But most unlike Lenin, the antidote to the sins of capitalism, that is, the ones who regard the men whom they used as mere instruments of profit, wasn't what the Bolsheviks offered but rather, Wilson argued, Christianity. Only thus can discontent be driven out and all the shadows lifted from the road ahead. Here is the final challenge to our churches, to our political organizations, and to our capitalists, to everyone who fears God or loves his country. Shall we not all earnestly cooperate to bring in the new day? 152 Wilson thought, therefore, there were capitalists who had better angels. 153 Despite such illusions, as Lenin would have contended, Wilson's too oft ignored essay registers the profound impact the Bolshevik Revolution had on ruling elites in real time. 154 The triumphalism that greeted the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 gave the false impression that Wilson's class heirs were always confident they would prevail over what the Bolsheviks had initiated. His essay clearly says otherwise. 155 Wilson and Lenin died within a couple of weeks of one another in 1924. The images of their funerals stand in stark contrast. To understand, consider a couple of vignettes of Lenin from Bullett's March 1919 report that Wilson disowned. The food situation in Moscow and Petrograd was dire. Lenin and the other leaders of the revolution were on rations, the same as that of a soldier in the army or of a workman at hard labor. Breakfast, a quarter to a half pound of black bread, which must last all day, and tea without sugar. Dinner, a good soup, a small piece of fish, for which occasionally a diminutive piece of meat is substituted, a vegetable, either a potato or a bit of cabbage, more tea without sugar. Supper, what remains of the morning ration of bread and more tea without sugar. The second vignette was when Bullitt first met Lenin at the Kremlin. I had to wait a few minutes until a delegation of peasants left his room. They had heard in their village that Comrade Lenin was hungry. And they had come hundreds of miles carrying 800 of bread as the gift of the village to Lenin. Just before them was another delegation of peasants to whom the report had come that Comrade Lenin was working in an unheated room. They came bearing a stove and enough firewood to heat it for 3 months. Lenin is the only leader who receives such gifts. And he turns them into the common fund. 156 That Bullitt came away from the visit with a more sympathetic opinion of the Bolshevik leader is not surprising, for which the anti-Bolshevik press roundly criticized him. 157 Their funerals were held in the dead of winter in Washington, D.C. and Moscow, in fact, 35 below Celsius in the latter. Images of the public response to both were captured on film. 158 But it's not hard to imagine, given Bullitt's report, where the greatest outpourings of grief took place at least 1,000-fold greater. 159 The volumes speak volumes about how their own citizens regarded both leaders in real time. What, to repeat, are the broad and key conclusions to be drawn from the four real-time politics comparisons? How do the claims, again, that Marx, Engels and Lenin made about the historical moments under examination, the French edition of the European Spring, the American Civil War, the Russian Revolution of 1905, and the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 and end to World War I, compare and contrast to those of Tocqueville, Mill, Weber, and Wilson? What about the events with which I've supplemented the Marx-Mill and Lenin-Weber comparisons, respectively electoral reform in Britain and the consequences of the October 1917 revolution for Germany? To what extent are the readings of the protagonists of the events in agreement and disagreement? Which of them had a more accurate reading and made better forecasts? How did their theoretical/political views influence their responses? How do the four comparisons reveal key differences between Marxist and different varieties of liberal real-time politics? Most important, to what extent did their actions advance the democratic quest that was posed in all four moments? Can, lastly, a case be made for a superior theoretical purchase of either perspective for doing real-time politics? These are the questions to interrogate the four comparisons. Attention then turns to subsequent historical developments. First, how fascism and Stalinism enabled World War II and, second, a Cold War scenario that continues to resonate. Washington versus Havana. Can comparative real-time political analysis for both cases, as is done for the four in this inquiry, namely, Marxist versus liberal readings and actions, bring new clarity to them? Lastly, and in the spirit of real-time politics, are there lessons from the four comparisons for contemporary politics in all their complexity and unprecedented character? Four comparisons. Marx and Engels versus Tocqueville. The European Spring, the French edition certainly, was no surprise for Marx, Engels, and Tocqueville. They all saw it coming, if not the timing. They also agreed that the class interests of the bourgeoisie, the class actually in power during Louis Philippe's regime, would come under threat. For the first time, unlike the 1789 revolution, social rights, like the right to work, and not just political rights, like the right to vote, were on the agenda. For Tocqueville it would be the haves versus the have-nots, whereas for Marx and Engels, as they announced in their just published manifesto of the Communist Party, the modern proletariat versus the bourgeoisie. And 2 months earlier Engels predicted accurately in a metaphorical if not literal sense that liberal reformers like Tocqueville would hide themselves in the darkest corner of their houses, or be scattered like dead leaves before the popular thunderstorm. Tocqueville would not have disagreed with Marx's and Engels's framing the coming revolt in terms of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie. But if he thought it was strange doctrines, spreading among the French proletariat that explained the February Revolution, that is, socialist ideas, Marx had a more accurate read. Working-class starvation, due to the first transnational capitalist crisis, was the more proximate cause of the revolt. Socialist consciousness amongst the Parisian proletariat was still a work in progress. He therefore differed sharply with Tocqueville on what the February overthrow of Louis Philippe had ushered in. February for Marx was to complete the rule of the bourgeoisie, whereas for Tocqueville socialism will always remain the most essential feature of the February Revolution. The differences are instructive and most relevant for contemporary debates about socialism. A republic surrounded by social institutions, due to the social demands of the Parisian proletariat who were decisive in Louis Philippe's deposition, is how Marx described the provisional government. Instituted in Paris, in other words, was, in today's lingo, a liberal welfare state or, perhaps, the first social democratic government in history. A genuine socialist revolution, as Engels explained before the February Revolution, would destroy not only the political, but the social power of capital that will guarantee their social welfare, along with their political strength. The social power of the bourgeoisie, as the manifesto explained, rested on private property still very much in place after February. The overthrow could not, therefore, have been, contra Tocqueville, a socialist revolution. Only in June would that possibility be posed. Despite Tocqueville's misreading of the social content of February, he did grasp something of profound importance that Marx and Engels would have agreed with. He was smart enough to see that the social power of capital was still in place, before and after February, that is, private property, the foundation of social order as he put it. Being still in place, private property created understandable, but not acceptable, betraying Tocqueville's class orientation resentment amongst the working classes. The revolution of 1789 has stripped private property of its ancient aristocratic entitlements and trappings. Yet it continued to exercise its social power in a world in which those at the bottom of society could now vote or expect to do so, the result of 1789. Along with increased prosperity owing to the new mode of production, capitalism, the new political/economic scenario bred frustration, relative deprivation as modern social science calls it, amongst the historically excluded layers of society. And that frustration was being fed by dangerous ideas, amongst which was that the unalterable laws that constitute society resting upon the foundation of social order, that is, private property, and providence, could be repealed. Increasing working class awareness that this new social arrangement was the main obstacle to equality among men was inherently destabilizing for bourgeois hegemony. Marx and Engels would have concurred with Tocqueville's keen insight, for them one of the redeeming features of the capitalist mode of production. As the opening pages of the manifesto explained, the modern bourgeois society that has sprouted from the ruins of feudal society has not done away with class antagonisms, it has simplified class antagonism. That Tocqueville could consider that the unalterable laws of class society, private property, were not set in stone and, thus, be repealed would also have resonated with Marx and Engels. Though he confessed to having been tempted to consider the socialist alternative unsettling for some of his modern-day admirers, his class allegiances wouldn't allow him to go there. The June Revolution put a definitive end to any possible convergence of political perspectives of Marx and Engels, and Tocqueville. In the run-up to the upheaval, Marx and Tocqueville often agreed about the ineptness of the provisional government, particularly regarding the peasantry, though from different sides of the class divide. Once the revolt began, however, it required both of them to take sides, to vote with their feet. Can there be any doubt that the democratic credentials of Marx were more deserved than those of Tocqueville? That moment more than any other defined the political Tocqueville, about which there is still a deafening silence amongst his admirers. If he had once been a prevaricating liberal, in June he found his voice. While Marx and Engels were doing everything they could at the same moment to advance the democratic revolution in Germany, Tocqueville made sure it would be crushed in France. Perhaps, to be charitable, he couldn't see that the bloodbath he helped to lead would undermine France's second attempt to institute liberal democracy. Marx, on the other hand, accurately foresaw that the slaughter spelled the beginning of the end of the Second Republic. Eliminating the working class from the picture, specifically the Parisian component, meant that Republican governance had lost its most ardent and capable defender. Only the working class, he and Engels had concluded in 1844, had the interest and capability in advancing the democratic quest what Tocqueville could never imagine. If ever there were a moment in history when two competing political perspectives were so starkly counterpoised, the June Revolution must certainly qualify as a leading candidate. The best that Tocqueville defenders might say about his actions in June is that the road to hell is oftentimes paved with good intentions. But from then on he actively campaigned to limit political space in France, all in the name of trying to save the Republic and to be led by a small group of like-minded moderate liberals. There was a remarkable and instructive coincidence of opinion between Marx and Tocqueville about the right-to-work provision in the draft constitution before and after the June Revolution, that the latter played a major role in writing. Though Marx thought the provision to be in the bourgeois sense, an absurdity, a miserable pious wish, Tocqueville confirmed one of the essential lessons in the Marx-Engels arsenal. He admitted that the only reason it was included in the pre-June draft, the first time ever anywhere, was due to fear of outside events and the excitement of the moment, and pressure of revolutionary ideas. In Germany, Marx and Engels had argued against reform liberals like Tocqueville who believed that what takes place within the parliamentary arena is the ultima thule of politics, what they ridiculed as parliamentary cretinism. Those afflicted with the incurable malady, as Engels sarcastically put it, think that all and everything going on outside the walls of their house, wars, revolutions, and whatever else, is nothing compared to the incommensurable events hinging upon the important question, whatever it may be, just at that moment occupying the attention of their honorable house. One Tocqueville's invaluable admission would have been welcomed ammunition for them in their debates with the liberals, including current varieties. What about Marx's explanation for the defeat of the Parisian proletariat, the lack of leadership and organization? Was that hindsight? Both he and Engels had argued at least 4 years earlier that the working class needed to prepare itself for its revolutionary tasks in order to be successful, the raison d'être for their manifesto. Engels reported approvingly 3 months before the revolt that the French proletariat was engaged in study and smartly avoiding being prematurely provoked into combat. Though fragmentary, their real-time accounts indicate that they recognized that the preparatory process in France was still a work in progress in the lead-up to June. In Germany, at the very same moment, they were doing all they could to provide leadership, program, and organization to its proletariat facing a similar situation. The hindsight accusation, if made, is therefore unwarranted. Assuming, however, as they did that socialist revolution was on the agenda in 1848 to 1849 is a valid accusation. Their subsequent balance sheets, their own second-guessing, admitted to that mistaken assumption. Point 2. The defeat of the Parisian proletariat emboldened Tocqueville to not only strike the right-to-work provision from the draft constitution but to go after other democratic rights won in the February Revolution to endorse the imposition of what he unabashedly termed a parliamentary dictatorship. From then on, the most outstanding difference between Tocqueville and the Marx-Engels team was the former's belief that he and his coterie could save the Republic by appeasing the most conservative elements in the National Assembly and Louis Bonaparte himself. Far earlier than Tocqueville, Marx recognized that it was only a matter of time, given the rooting of the Parisian proletariat, that Napoleon's nephew would seek to emulate his uncle. Louis Bonaparte's election in December 1848, the first presidential election in Europe based on universal male suffrage, the product of February, had raised, Tocqueville recognized and feared, working-class expectations. Both he and Marx recognized the dilemma the bourgeoisie had created for itself. For Marx, however, there was a deeper problem for Tocqueville and the class he sought to represent. The granting of universal male suffrage in company with a constitution that guaranteed, at least on paper, private property, the social power of the bourgeoisie, made for an inherently tense-fraught political reality. Not for naught did those with property resist for so many centuries the granting of the vote to those without property, their fear that the latter would use the vote to infringe on their property. The tension was resolved in May 1850 when the Assembly abolished universal male suffrage, the coup d'état of the bourgeoisie as Marx called it. From then on, in Marx's opinion, it wasn't a question if but only when Louis Bonaparte would rid himself of the irksome republic. Tocqueville and his faction either enabled or acquiesced in developments that paved the way for his fateful decision. If ever, Marx later wrote, an event has, well in advance of its coming, cast its shadow before it, it was Bonaparte's coup d'état. Tocqueville wasn't clueless about what was in the making. It's just that his core political being would not allow him to do what would have been necessary to prevent the coup. Though written after the fact, Marx's forecast that mobilizing the masses was the last thing Tocqueville and faction would do to resist the overthrow was consistent with all he had said in his real-time reading of them as they operated in alliance with the Party of Order. For Tocqueville to have admitted as much in the lead-up to the coup and unavailable to Marx is one of those rare moments in the annals of real-time politics of near-perfect complementarity of opposing views. At the very core of the differences between Marx and Engels, on one hand, and Tocqueville, on the other, was which class to look to for advancing the democratic quest. Tocqueville thought that like-minded liberals like himself could do the job. But when it became clear that wasn't possible, he decided, rather than appeal to revolutionary passions, to hold his nose and stomach the grotesque mediocrity, Marx's indelible label for Louis Bonaparte. Liberal betrayal, in Marx's and Engels's opinion, was the chief lesson of the European Spring. Only if the working class, as well, organized itself independently of them could true democracy and human emancipation become a reality. No one, as the third and fourth cases in this book reveal, took those lessons to heart as much as Lenin. What Marx and Engels distilled from the European Spring would be, therefore, enormously consequential. Tocqueville, then, beginning with what his Democracy in America taught the young Marx, and then later what the lessons of the liberal hand-wringing of his cohorts in 1848 to 1851 taught Lenin, aided and abetted, inadvertently, the communist project, one of the great ironies of modernity. Point 3. Marx versus Mill. The overthrow of the American slavocracy was the decisive political event of the 19th century. It advanced the democratic quest unlike any other development since the 1789 French Revolution. It was the test for anyone's democratic credentials, including those of John Stuart Mill and Karl Marx. Marx and Mill, unlike Marx/Engels and Tocqueville regarding the French events in 1848 to 1851, both observed and responded to the American conflagration from afar, the same city, London, and a few miles from one another, making thus for a fairer comparison. They both relied, for the most part, on the same sources for making their claims. Tocqueville's democracy, also, played a major role in their understanding of the country, though in different ways informing their different motives for supporting the Union cause. For Marx, the communist, the end of chattel slavery would advance the class struggle and, thus, the fight for true democracy. For Mill, the liberal, it was mainly a moral cause. How Marx and Mill read and responded to the French edition of the European Spring anticipated their reaction to the Civil War. Mill, for the most part, took a more progressive stance on the revolution than his erstwhile friend Tocqueville. Unlike the latter, he supported the provisional government, though skeptical about its endorsement of the right-to-work demands of the proletariat. There is no evidence that he sanctioned the bloodbath in June 1848 that Tocqueville enabled. Problematic was Mill's denial of the slaughter. Not one person has been shot, not one life taken, by the authority of government in consequence of the insurrection. His embrace of the world's first social democratic government made him effectively an apologist for its sanguinary actions. From afar, like Mill, Marx reported more accurately the brutality meted out to the Parisian proletariat. What most distinguished Marx from Mill regarding the European Spring was his willingness, under very difficult personal circumstances, to find the time, energy, and resources to draw a balance sheet on what had taken place in France, his class struggles and 18th Brumaire. For Mill,